Research Committee. So on behalf of the entire committee, thank you for attending. How many of you were here for the first and second, well, let's say the second workshop? Okay, so yeah, we saw you last month. And what about the first workshop? At any more? Okay, so quite a few of you have been here for all three, so that's wonderful. Let me just tell you, for those who haven't been here before, so the workshop is presented by the Research Committee of SEMCME. SEMCME is the largest community-based medical education consortium in the Midwest. Its primary mission is to stimulate the delivery of quality care through excellence in graduate medical education and faculty development. I should mention that all of today's PowerPoint presentations can be found at the SEMCME website under Workshop Content. All of you should have signed in and registered at the table outside, so I assume you did that. Please make sure that all your pagers and cell phones are turned off or on silent mode at this time so you don't interrupt anybody. And we have a number of speakers here today, so during the breaks, if you would like to ask any of us a question, maybe specific to your research project, we would be happy to help you with that. So today's purpose here is to discuss written and oral presentation of scientific research. So we've been through research design and hypothesis testing, statistical analysis. So now today you're going to learn about, at the very end, once you've done your project, how to write things up, and as well as do a QI project, which we'll have next, and then moving on to how to write things up in terms of an abstract, a case report, giving an oral presentation, a poster presentation. So let me introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Lisa Dillon. She joined the DMC GME office recently. Well, I think it's been a little while now, right? Yeah. We got to update this. As the academic director. She entered GME in 2013 after over a decade of working as administrator in higher education and as a professor. Her main role centered on developing an annual report template to gather data for GME reporting in the form of the annual institutional review, executive summary, and so forth. To date, she has authored 3 GME articles on her projects, 6 posters, and has won an award for Best Poster at the Association for Independent Academic Medical Centers. She works closely with residents through the Resident Council on QI initiatives, and she earned her doctorate in psychology from Wayne State University, specializing in developmental psychology with an emphasis on evolutionary psychology, and a minor in quantitative measurement. When she's not working, she loves running with her goofy silver Labrador, Aggie, baking, gardening, and crafting. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Dillon.
Okay, that's better. Hello. So today I want to present on quality improvement projects, and I entitled the presentation Step by Step because we'll go over kind of the big why of quality improvement and go over the basics of what goes into the quality improvement methodology, and then walk through an actual project. So I'm the academic director for the Detroit Medical Center, and usually I monitor a lot of the scholarly activity for residents and kind of route a lot of the projects that they do to the proper, connections, like to certain committees or assist with IRB, things like that, or even kind of helping shape, methodology. So why is quality improvement important? And you all are familiar with ACGME requirements, and the common requirements, though they do get revised every couple of years, they seem to emphasize more and more that residents, must develop the skills and habits to really analyze systematically their practice, and specifically using quality improvement methods, and be able to, arrive at practice improvement. So there is that expectation. Some specialty-specific requirements even take it a step further to outline the number of projects that you must complete while you're in residency, and maybe even present those in certain areas. It depends. And if you go into fellowship, those requirements are even more ironed out and specified. But not only does ACGME have training requirements, but medical boards are now incorporating QI questions on exams, and that's coming for in-service exams if you haven't seen those already. Maintenance of certification points can usually be earned for quality improvement participation, depends on your specialty and what they will permit. And even hospitals are incentivizing for QI participation and will pay for performance initiatives. So, there's lots of reasons to care, but we can't forget the most important one, that our participation and on quality improvement initiatives can really lead to improved patient safety and patient care. So a common question I get is, that quality improvement is just like research, or you can, really design a quality improvement project using research methodology. And the answer is no. Quality improvement has separate methods. We'll talk about some. We'll talk about some resources that you can use. But really, do not think that they are the same, and you really need to master both, and because you need to be able to appraise the literature for its contributions, to be able to break it down and relate into how it fits into your specialty and with patient care. And with quality improvement, that may be important in your practice or in the hospital setting to improve things for patient treatment. So we'll go over some basic differences between quality improvement and research. And for research, which we've commonly participated in, where the goal may be overarching and big, you just want to contribute to the fund of knowledge that's out there. Whereas in quality improvement, you really just want to take some knowledge and apply it to clinical practice. And for me, as a longtime researcher, this is the part that was always missing. You could study relationships in research, you could, get some outcomes in research, but then how does that affect the individual? And quality improvement, it has distinct methodologies that allow you to accomplish that. So in some ways, it could be more meaningful, more immediate gratification, if you will, than some research methods. As regarding the testing and research, often there's one large blinded one, or several are planned but in separate studies. But in quality improvement, there can be many unblinded things that you observe, things that are happening in rapid fire, interventions that are happening one after another after you take a break to measure the impact of a previous intervention. With respect to bias, in research, you try to control for it as much as possible, but in quality improvement, you've recognized it as just part of the environment or part of the situation and context in which this project is being carried out. Data, you gather a lot of data in research, some of which you do not use, some of which you have to say how you plan to analyze it as you write the IRB. But with quality improvement, you're gathering enough to recognize your change and gathering enough of what you need to prepare to make that change. And the duration, or how long the project will last. Some projects, depending on what they are, if they're longitudinal studies, they can last for years, or labs can inherit studies. I've seen that, and things will continue on, time after time. But in QI, they can be, it depends on how much time you want to invest in the scope of your project. There can be shorter, predictable periods that you can adjust, or your team can adjust. So with all that, what exactly is quality improvement? In QI, you identify a problem, and then you set about a way of systematically testing solutions until you find one that eradicates or corrects the problem or reduces it meaningfully, depending on what the team decides. You take intentional steps to solve the problem. And so what are those intentional steps? What might they look like? Well, in research, you want proof, you have testable hypotheses that can be refuted or supported. But in QI, you are looking more for sustained improvement. So let's say maybe you want to reduce fall risk, by a certain percentage. That's not exactly cut and dry like proof of that something works. You're actually showing that over time, that whatever your intervention was, that it's actually sustaining the change. And if it doesn't, then maybe you need to revisit what has changed so you can have another intervention. So we talked about data collection, sufficient versus just enough data, to show the proof of your efficacy or the sustained improvement. And method, in research, we have fixed hypotheses that once they go on the IRB, not allowed to change. But QI, sometimes there are distinct IRB processes that are more focused on the kind of data that you're gathering, like the identified data, for example, so that you can test your change, and it may bypass some of that. And the results evaluation, commonly pre and post interventions in some cases, but with QI, there can be regular assessments or index feeds after the project is considered completing a certain cycle, so you can see if the improvement has been maintained. So when deciding what kind of project you might like to pick for, whatever it is, either something's bothering you, or it's a goal of yours to carry out a QI project, or you want to join a team, I encourage some brainstorms that I'm about to describe. I do this myself, and because I'm not a clinician, I might be kind of really distally involved with some QA projects, so that I do this with kind of inter-office problems. So you look around and you ask yourself, what's broken, or what's not working, what's not functioning properly. And the follow-up question, once you settle on something that really interests you, is asking who has the authority to change this. And this is a critical question, because if you cannot find who can change this, the likelihood of your QI project having that sustainable outcome is very challenged. So, so if you don't know, you start talking to people, talk to your faculty, talk to other residents, talk to senior residents, talk to hospital leadership, talk to clinic managers, until, you might, even though one role may have an answer for you that makes sense, you keep on asking, because perception of who has the authority versus the reality can be a little bit different. Another question I would encourage you to ask is, are the ideas that you have, or the problem that you want to solve, is it aligned with site priorities? And so how many of you have been involved in a clear visit recently, or in your training? At the DMC, we just finished our 3rd clear visit. And a common question they ask is not only like, do you know what quality improvement is? Do you know, they might ask you questions about methodology, but they'll also ask, are the projects that you're doing actually important to the site where you're at? And it isn't to say that any topic is bad, because any improvement is an improvement. However, if it's aligned with what the hospital has on its website, for example, like, core measures, for that institution, and that one may grease the wheels of, gathering support for your project, and, which is important. And then it's also important for just trainees to know how leadership sees quality improvement and what really should be those priorities. Another question to ask is, how much time do you want to invest? How much do you have? At the DMC, we do a quality improvement presentation day, where we have residents presenting their posters on quality improvement projects. We have an oral competition and a poster competition for that. So we usually start advertising for that in the summer, and then more heavily in the fall and winter, because they may only select 6 months, give or take a few, to actually carry out the project. So we'll go through a project and run through the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. This cycle itself is kind of overarching of what QI is, and any methodology you pick would go in so the do phase of this Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. You'll see as we go through the example that a lot of the work, if you will, or a lot of the preparation is in the planning phase. If you have a solid, planning phase, the rest of the project can go quite smoothly. If things are overlooked, you might find yourself having to return back to the planning phase in order to rectify or to gather more information. So I cannot emphasize enough that, if you're planning on carrying out a project, that be very cautious and check and recheck that you've kind of gone through the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle and spent most of the time on the planning. And so ways to help yourself along is that usually most institutions have resources to help you. They may have required modules through the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. That's pretty common. They may have hospital committees that you can join that have kind of publish or print out their own QI methodologies for that, and templates for people to use. So that way you're kind of guided. You have some guidance. Depending on your academic affiliation, they may even have resources for you as well. So we'll go through a project, and you'll see them tagged by either a P, D, and an S or an A. Whoops, sorry, a little clicker happy. Okay, so the first step is to select your project. And this is where you go back to that initial brainstorm, and where you kind of ask yourself, did anyone else agree with the suggestions that you were having? Did you find out who had the authority to actually change, and do they care about making that change because it's an important priority where you're at? And then it comes to like, well, what kind of baseline data or information do you have? Because you have to know where you're starting in order to say you're going to make a change. And sometimes the reason it's a critical step is sometimes our perception of what problems or issues there are really kind of contrast with what's going on. So then you might need to refine your topic. Do you have to refine it a bit, or you may, depending when you bring team members on, may hone the idea a bit more. And throughout the conversations, did you accompany or find any resistance from staff, managers, and other leaders that, depending on how they reacted to the project, or were they trying to maybe steer the project in a certain direction? So our sample project is reducing the risk of wrong site surgery. I'm taking my own advice here and picking a topic, that interests me. So the second step is to assemble a quality improvement project team. And another critical step right from the gate, because you have to have a team of the right people around the table. And while the groups are best, the smaller they are, because there's less diffusion of responsibility, and sometimes there's more cohesiveness in smaller groups, you still at the end of the day have to make sure that you have the right people around the table, like who can make the change, or a structure like the meeting attendance so that it so that they are involved as much as they can be, but maybe not at every meeting. So a sample of the right team members for wrong site surgery would be resident leaders, but also surgical schedulers, the physicians, lead OR nurses, even the director or the CNO of nursing, and other staff. Depending on where you're at, the team may need to be modified. But so let you know, I will say this, I've seen a lot of quality improvement projects go really well, residents working really hard and identify things that would save their hospital, well, lots of money, like hundreds of thousands of dollars. But because they didn't start with the right team, they didn't involve them right away, trying to convince them after the fact was pretty much impossible. And it's a shame. So whenever I do have the opportunity to stress that you must inform the powers that be, you really need to do that from the get-go, and including their input from the start helps make changes later on. So on your team member roles, there should be a project sponsor. This is someone who's connected to senior management in some way. Could be a faculty member, could be a mentor that is assigned, depends on your situation, but they generally might not attend the QI team meeting. You may report out to this person to keep them abreast of what's going on with the project. There should be a QI leader. This is a person that would be implementing changes, and they must have the authority necessary. So again, make sure that you have that. There should be a QI methods expert. Sometimes this is a representative from the hospital, or it could be just a resident who's really interested and has an idea or working knowledge of several methods that might be appropriate, or just access to resources. Local topic experts, people who deal with the topic every day, being sure to also have someone with an outside perspective for fresh eyes and being able to raise important questions, or to get the team to kind of stop and consider other things that they may have overlooked, and a project manager to keep the project on track, like who's going to schedule the meetings, who is taking minutes from these meetings, who's kind of sending reminders to keep things humming along. And people can wear multiple hats as long as it's not to the point where it's overwhelming. So still in the planning phase, we're going on to step 3, where the team needs to develop aims. So, notice aims versus hypothesis. So an aim statement, this is, acts as your compass. This is the guide, for the project, and it focuses the team's efforts. So it's really a specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound statement of what your team wants to do. And there are many ways to do this. Most of your resources will include questions like the following to get the team to focus on what they want to accomplish. So the first is, what's the problem? And then picking a goal. and that is measurable. So you might focus on improving or reduction or an increase, but then you're going to come up with a rate that goes along with that. And then a statement of why the project would be important. So, like, so what, or why bother doing this project? This helps when you're later on asked that same question by other people when, you're trying to implement the change, like the rationale, for the project. And then who's affected by this project? Who's the target, population? Like who or what areas the project focus on? So, and you also include when the project will be completed. That also, like the project manager might, weigh in on this because that helps to kind of decide like what the meeting flow should be, the follow-up time should be. So including specific, time points. You can deviate a little bit, but this should really be your target. And then how this will be carried out. So it's not a task list of the strategies that you will employ, but methods that you might, draw from, at least initially, to implement your changes. Or if there's a certain like toolkit or like resource that you're going to use, you would include that at that time, and things become more specific as time goes on. And then at the end, you include what your measurable goals. And so you would have to conduct a baseline assessment to focus these, or if you would have to request baseline data, depending where you're at, to get this information. And so the next, we're still in the planning phase. You would get some root cause analysis, methodology to kind of figure out contributing factors, to your problem. So I have a sample in here covering up part of my word here because I didn't want it to be too terribly small, so it should show up when you download them. So, but one popular example is the team would conduct a fishbone diagram analysis of the problem, and this explores contributing factors to the issue at hand that might be related to the materials involved, methods or processes that are involved, the environment itself, equipment, people, and measurement. So like what problems with wrong site surgery are linked to the way, like people, and or like what about the equipment? Is the environment set up in a certain way that's kind of contributing to making a mistake with respect to wrong site surgery? Are there certain methods that are going on that are also contributing to this? And so this is a brainstorm, no right or wrong, but the focus is to kind of organize what the team is saying into these areas so that you can use the information a bit better later on. You simply put the problem, is the head of the fish, and then you can break out the contributing factors for the ribs, and then everything that people says fills in after that. So you might say like, well, if you're want to learn more about research methods and QI methods, I would suggest these books. They fit into a white coat pocket pretty easily. You can actually, I think, get apps. Some are free, some are not. And there's, this one has about 20 different quality improvement methods, but you'll find others, like if you just do the app, you might find a bit more. And so when you have downtime or when the Wi-Fi is, not working, you have a minute and you can read these and kind of see, what you might be able to use before you even start a project. When I read these, I usually pick a problem, that's going on in the office and see how, it might apply, to that. So I find that it helps me actually remember, what that strategy actually is or how it might be used, and a bit better. So kind of cheap, but there's free ones out there, but just get something that's going to help you kind of focus on what you might like to use. So back to our project with the wrong site surgery, the sample aims for this could be, like our aim is to reduce the number of surgical cases with risk for wrong site surgery in the OR from X to X, presuming we have baseline data and we want to go to from one level to another. And so our justification, doing so will foster good relationships with our patient population and reduce healthcare costs. These aren't exhaustive reasons, but it is the rationale in this, that this fake team is coming up with. So our how, our general, like, how are we going to accomplish this? Well, so we picked, 5 areas here. One being the use of primary documentation in the verification process of where the surgery should occur, preoperative briefings, talking about where it should take place, the use of site markers for the surgery, intraoperative site verification before the cuts are made, and reduce timeout distractions, or making sure that surgical timeouts actually take place as they should. Still in the planning phase. Okay, So after we have our aims, that aim statement is written, printed, distributed to every team member, and is kind of that document that you constantly return to keep the project, focused. But once you're there, you can now start developing measures. And this is where you start looking at, well, what you might like to do to achieve your aim. And so you start asking, the team would need to be asking questions like, well, how will we know our changes are an improvement? Well, one, by comparing to baseline data. And, if your outcome of focus is reduced wrong site surgery, it's a count process. And then, well, what will we do to achieve the outcome? So this is where the team can decide what changes they want to make. And the use of the QI, tools might help you see how certain changes might have more of an impact than others, depending on the baseline data that you have access to. But you also need to consider what could be messed up, while you're trying to improve the process, because just as you make one change, it may result in another problem. And we are still in the planning phase. So on developing measures, to continue to explain a little bit more about what these are. So one measure we could use for wrong site surgery is the use of secret shoppers of a sort, like volunteers who set out to observe pre and post intervention data on what's going on in each of these areas. So they might look at the primary documentation, the briefings, the use of site markers, and how site verification is conducted in the timeout, distraction observations, and bring that back to the team to decide where the area of biggest impact might be, and that's where you might start to implement your change primarily. Regarding balancing measures, so this is where maybe more of the team, would respond, or you might even survey surgery to see what would be affected by a certain change. And there's likely, there would be concerns over the schedule, time or delays in care or delays in start time, and even supporting staff coverage depending on what you're trying to implement. So it's up to the team to then evaluate the changes they want to make. They want to look at for ones that are value added, and there might be some that are not necessarily value added, but necessary because they bring you up to compliance or something like that. And then you may also sort other activities into non-value added. So maybe come up with ways to eliminate them before implementing your own interventions. And notice we are still in the planning phase. So moving on to step 5, after you've gone through that, you can start to focus on identifying change ideas. So what changes can you make that will result in a reduction? So after you've had that observation data brought back, after you've considered your balancing measures, you might also do what's called a Gemba walk. And some of these processes come from the engineering field, where everyone has a standardized set of questions, and you actually walk the process that you're trying to improve. And so this is different from the secret shoppers who are just doing observations to kind of get you information. Now that you have that information, you can use that to ask questions, well, why is this done this way? Or what's the impact? And you walk the process and you talk to the people carrying out the process from start to finish. And the goal is to arrive at what should the process be, and by talking to all personnel. And this information is taken and can create a value stream map that kind of shows the current process, like shows kind of the breakdowns where people aren't following the guidelines, aren't being compliant. You might even look for patterns in patient characteristics or thinking and you want to change. And it may not be what you intended to do in the first place. So step 6, you want to test change ideas, and this is where you would test one at a time, and notice we have finally progressed into the do phase. And so you would be reviewing cases for wrong site risk and noting where the OR protocol was influenced or note where there are areas of noncompliance. And then you can continue to add on until the initial target and the aim is met. So maybe the use of site markers was the biggest area of noncompliance, then you can show what improvement you achieved with that intervention alone, and then you can add on another along with that. Sometimes people choose to measure them separately and then combine, but that is tolerated. And this is considered part of the study phase because now you're looking at outcomes. on the step 8, analyzing the data. This is the last part of the study phase. And so after you implement the changes, you go back to the aim and look at, did we actually achieve our target? And you can do it's commonly done, a pre and post comparison, but sometimes not, but you reflect on what was learned and what can be carried over to the next PDSA. Because your timeline may end and there may still be other changes that you weren't able to get to. And that's perfectly acceptable because you can actually pass the project off or recruit other members, recruit other resident members who are maybe joining the residency and then can then partake, and they're kind of joining something that's already been underway that kind of sets them up for success. And so to sustain the project through the next PDSA cycle, you would kind of set up a time to index the results. Are you sustaining this change? Sometimes quarterly, sometimes annually, and the results should be communicated in a way for everyone, to see, so they can reflect that, that the team effort and the interventions, are still exerting an effect. Recruit the new members, and then you can repeat the PDSA, because that was just one cycle. You can make use of other changes not tested, or they can revisit some of the other brainstorms and maybe things were overlooked. So the summary of the steps, are here. As you can see, most of the work is in the planning phase with a little, even though they might take up a chunk of time themselves, but very focused things in the do, study, and act phase. So thank you for your time. If you have any questions. All right. Okay, thanks.
Any questions for Dr. Dillon? Do any of you plan to do a QI project? Okay, do you have any ideas at this point as to what you might do? What do you want to share? You raised your hand. Would you kind of just tell us kind of what you plan to do?
So our pathology laboratory or toxicology laboratory has developed in-house assay for therapeutic drug monitoring of antifungal drugs, which used to be a send-out test earlier. So we are going to go live in January, and we are going to compare the hospital stay, so in terms of how many days patient stays when we used to send out the test, and compared to when we do the test in-house.
Okay.
That is preliminary plan.
Okay. All right. Any comments from Lisa on that, or?
No, I would just, have you started? Like you have your team?
Yes. So we did not start yet. The test is going to start in January.
But the team is assembled, like it sounds like. Okay.
Yes. So pharmacy, pathology, and infectious disease department.
Okay.
Okay, so it does sound like you have the right team.
So we submitted IRB application, and we are thinking that it would be an exempt test because we are not going to keep the patient identifiers or anything.
And that's usually so you should get approval or support a bit earlier.
Yes.
Dr. Dillon, is it customary then to send these projects to the IRB for review before you start?
It really depends on where you're at. I know DMC and Wayne State, you kind of fill out an initial form for the IRB, and they will funnel you into either the QI category or the research category. And if it's QI, you get a letter of support or awareness, and the project continues because usually you're collecting de-identified data.
Okay. So I hope everybody heard that. You should have an IRB review. So you shouldn't just decide that it's a QI study, it's exempt, I don't need to go to the IRB.
Yeah, I'll reiterate that. Do not decide that on your own.
Right.
And usually you won't be able to collect, they won't give you any data. The people who, are protecting the information usually won't without that paper. So.
Yeah, very good point. Okay. Any other questions? Anybody else want to share other ideas for a QI project? Anybody else? Okay. All right. Thanks, Dr. Dillon. Appreciate it. Okay, so let's take about a 10-minute break or so, and then we'll continue on with our program.
For their prestigious journal. So they're a little bit down, but you get a well-developed, a well-written case report, and they're certainly into that. The other thing that really helps in recent years, there's a number of online journals that are devoted only to case reports. There's the Journal of Medical Clinical Case Reports. There's the BMJ, British Medical Journal Case Reports. There's a number of those kind of things, and certainly when you submit to those, you've got a very good chance of getting it published. Now, Sir William Osler, he was, and they have a T here instead of the L, but he was many years ahead of me at Johns Hopkins. But one of the things he said, and it still goes true at Hopkins today because they say it when you're a trainee there, is that what you're looking for is a case to publish or present. You're looking for that case, a common presentation of an unusual illness or an unusual presentation of a common illness. So in other words, you're looking for that variation there, and that's a simple way of what you're looking for with a case report. There's some other things we'll talk about in a minute that go into a case report as well. How do we know if a case report is publishable? Well, we're going to have to do some sort of a literature review because to you and me, it may be a very unique case. It looks like something very interesting should be published, but how do we know it hasn't been published a number of times before? So again, we start looking at our various tools. You might look at PubMed, you might look at OVID, you might look at Embase, Medline. You may even do a simple Google search, but get an idea of how much this has been published before. Typically, if something's been published more than 4 to 6 times, it's going to be a little difficult to get it published as a manuscript. And certainly, if you get up to something that's been published 10 times, boy, your case better be very, very, very unique to get it published at that point. I mentioned patient consent. We have to get patient consent. And then we'll talk about how to identify the journals that we want to put it in. But simply put, we're looking for that journal that has a focus on what we're trying to present, has the audience we'd like to present this case report to, and then we want to have the appropriate impact of that particular journal. So again, a new disease, a new syndrome. Now, right down there it says therapy, adverse response. You can certainly write a case report about a unique side effect of a new medication, for instance. That would be a case report. But just remember, that would not be a good case report if you're reporting on something. For instance, you have a patient that just started a new medication for their hyperlipidemia, and they complain about myalgias and muscle tenderness and pressure and so on. And that new medication that you're writing, and it's not been reported before, and you're writing up this article, just remember, if that new medication is in the statin category, it doesn't count. So again, if something new is part of a category that's been repeatedly reported, then you're not going to get too far with it. The same thing, too. You might take something that if somebody's got a metastatic bone disease secondary to prostate cancer, and you tend to think of the spine and the hip and places like that, but you want to report, gosh, we found a met in the ring finger, the right ring finger. That's not going to go any place either because everybody knows that metastatic disease of the prostate could be just any place. So those are some examples that wouldn't be good case reports. Again, if you can appeal to somebody's emotion, that's great. And then always, I'm going to over and over again, I'll mention, is there any learning points, take-home points, any pearls to this case? That's what people want to see, too, when they do a case report. So again, I mentioned 4 to 6 times or less is appropriate. Greater than that, you're going to have a more difficult time. Certainly, if it's more than 10, you're going to have an extremely difficult time getting it published. I'm not going to go into a lot about the consent here, but certainly you'd like to have a written consent from the patient. Sometimes that patient has actually expired. You have to get a written consent from the estate and so on and so forth. Now, you need to really follow the HIPAA guidelines because, again, that could even lead to fines or even imprisonment if you vary too much from them. Identifying data, you want to get away from that. In other words, it's okay to say gender, race, occupation. Those kind of things are fine to say, but don't say things like give their initials, date of birth, and things like that. So again, identify a journal, as I just mentioned. go ahead and look at for that one that's in the field that you're trying to publish in. You're looking at their audience. Does it appear to be an appropriate audience? Do they have the impact factor that you'd like to see? Those are all good things. And then actually go to those journals. And I would like to see people identify at least 3 or 4 journals and then actually look at their instructions for writing case reports. Does it look like something that's reasonable? And then also look at the case reports they already have. And do this over and over again. Always look and see what they've already published in those journals and to see if that style fits you as well. So again, we've talked about the topic area, prior description, and then frequency we've talked about as well. Now, some journals, actually a good number of journals, they will really like you to use the word case report in the title of the case report. There are others that don't want that word at all. So again, look at their instructions with regard to that. Typically, a title is about 8 to 9 words in length is what it is. And you might say, I want some kind of a title that will really catch their eye. Because remember, the title, if people are turned off by the title, they're not going to go any further with the case report. They'll just say, you know, this isn't for me. But again, you want something to catch your eye. Don't make it too cutesy and stuff like that. That turns people off too, so you don't overdo it as well. So these are the main points. Now, I'm talking about a clinical case report. As you get into the afternoon when we talk about original research manuscript production, they're going to be a little bit more structured, a little bit more particular. Now, you're going to hear some of the same things, whether you're developing an abstract, an original manuscript report, or in this case, a clinical case report. You're going to hear some of these same terms, introduction, you know, body, conclusion, and so on. But we use them just a little bit differently, and it's a little bit less structured with what I'm talking about, a case report. They give you a little bit more leeway here. In other words, some of these various components here, they may kind of merge or actually blend in with the next component, where in a true original research, they have to be definitely separated. So in other words, when I put down literature review, I put that right after discussion. Some reports or some case reports, that's fine to put right in with the case presentation, put the literature review. You don't have to break it up. When I say summary or conclusion at the bottom, some case reports will just make that part of the, like the last paragraph of the discussion. So again, you can kind of merge it or blend it a lot better with a clinical case report than you could with original research manuscript. So again, you want to try to address the overall case that you're trying to do. And again, try to introduce some of the similar case reports in the past in your introduction. So again, a good introduction might just be a sentence or two, just a few salient features of what the case report's going to be about. So let's start off with the abstract. And again, you can take a few notes on what I'm saying. I'm doing with a case report. When they talk about original research and some of the other things, the abstracts may be a little bit different. But for a case report, typically it's about 200 words, about 150 to 250 words. But you can look at the New England Journal of Medicine. They'll say anywhere from 100 to 350 words. Now, when you start getting up to 350 words, remember a typical manuscript for a case report is anywhere from 500 to 2,500 words. 500 to 2,500 words. So if you make the abstract too big, you're really cutting into your total word count. And you might say to me, well, Dr. O'Brien, what's the typical manuscript for like original research? It's typically 3,000 to 6,000 words. 3,000 to 6,000 words. And you'll have some journals will even take up to 12,000 or 13,000 words, but that's unusual for a regular original research article. So again, it's a little bit about the length of what the abstract can be, and you see what you're trying to do during the abstract. Now, there's two kinds of abstracts. There's a narrative abstract, case report, and then there's what they call a structured abstract. Some people like that better, a structured abstract, and that's where you have like subheadings. Every part of the abstract has a subheading where you put that component in, and it's more evidence-based. But again, I wouldn't say one is necessarily better than the other. I mean, you just have to do what that particular journal you select asks for. So again, these are the components of a case presentation, certainly a description of the patient. And I've said before, you know, you'll give age, gender, race, occupation, things like that. And again, stay away from the more confidential things, date of birth and things of that nature. Now, number 3, I said physical exam and relative test results. When you give relative test results, you know, You don't say the hemoglobin's within normal limits. You say the hemoglobin is 13.8. So be very exact in what you say. Don't say normal or within normal limits. You have to say exactly what the result is. And then just like when I mentioned that, abbreviations, I'll just cover that right now as well. Abbreviations, the first time you use an abbreviation, you should go ahead and define what the abbreviation is. When you're doing the abstract, just the abstract part of this whole manuscript, there should never be more than 3 abbreviations total in an abstract. Certainly you could have more in the body of it, but for the abstract, only 3 abbreviations max. Now, down below, the last thing I mentioned, actual outcome. So if you know this patient had some weird disease and they're having some unusual manifestations, it would be very nice if you could actually give a follow-up. Like the last patient visit I had with the patient, I noticed the manifestations had subsided or they've been exacerbated or they didn't respond to the therapy or whatever. So if you can give the last, contact you've had with the patient and the actual outcome, that's very nice as well. Okay, so I mentioned succinct, only important items. Certainly unusual tests, you have to go ahead and just put in what the range is for unusual tests. Now, few tables or images. Now, typically for a manuscript, a case report manuscript, usually they like to have maybe 1 or 2, whether it be a diagram, a graph, a photograph, X-ray, EKG, whatever you have. So you can use probably 1 to 2, even up to 3 graphics. But after 3 graphic images, they really don't want that in a case report. That would be like the max. And then later on, I'll mention too, is whenever you do those things, go back to the instructions for that particular journal, and the instructions come out either every issue or they'll come out twice a year in January and June, or if you can't find it there, you can't find it in the issue of the instructions, just go back to the web page. But use whatever way they say they want the legends labeled, and whichever way they want them numbered as well. Okay, now when you're writing a case report, they give you some editorial leeway. You have that ability to do it. So that means, for instance, we all like to slant things or bias things a little bit. And certainly if I'm writing a case report, I'd like to, make my point and show that everything runs in that particular direction. Well, sometimes maybe there's a factor, a figure that isn't exactly, maybe it's contrary to what I'm trying to prove or show. So you don't want to hide that or put that off, but you can emphasize. So that's the editorial ability that I have, is to actually focus or really concentrate on the points that really make my point of view known, and then just, not hide or push off to the side. I can mention the other points, but I don't have to emphasize them that much. Now, some people will actually say, okay, let me go back through the introduction. That's the sales pitch. The title is the catch-all, and some people say the discussion is the most important section of the whole thing. Significance of reporting this case. In other words, what makes this case unique? What makes it important? What are some take-home points for it? What are some pearls to know? What is the outcome of the case? So again, that can all be brought up in the discussion as it goes into the summary. So again, we always want to validate this as far as accuracy, validity, uniqueness. Compare and contrast, of course, to other cases that have been seen somewhat similar. Do we derive any new knowledge from this particular case that's being presented? And then can we draw some recommendations? You always want to support your argument. Hopefully you got literature to support your argument. Now, when you give references, for your literature, when you draw up your reference list later on, make sure there's a couple of things that you really can't use for references. One is, and you've seen this too in other types of manuscripts, you can't use personal communications. Don't use those. And of course, you can't reference an abstract. Reference in an abstract is considered inappropriate as well. So again, and I've said this more than once already, the conclusion, we're trying to give these people some take-home messages, something they can do. This is more than just an interesting article to read. This is something they're supposed to be able to use for their practice and take home with them. And it's not just only for providers. This is for scientists and other people to also get something out of this. Now, having consultants, whether it be radiologists, pathologists, internal medicine subspecialists, so on and so forth, that adds so much. And people, the readers, love to see that in our article. So if we can bring those people in. Now, and the other thing it allows those people to do is they come in, they can actually write their part of it collaboratively with the main writer. So in other words, maybe there's a section on the pathology, the histopathology of this new illness or whatever. Maybe there's something really unique about a radiograph. So that radiologist, that pathologist, that cardiologist, if they come in and help write the portion that makes that case unique from their perspective, then they can be a co-author. And we're not going to go into, who can be an author and who can't be a co-author today. But simply put, you have to do more than just reading the case at the very end, because that was kind of the old rules. Gosh, I'll just go over this, read it one time, maybe make a few corrections, and I can be a co-author. You can be somebody that's recognized, but you're really not an author. You have to do more than that. And here's a good way that other people can become authors by doing this. After I completed my training at Johns Hopkins, I went to the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And when I was there was the biggest arguments you can imagine when it came up who was going to be an author and who wasn't going to be an author. And in those days, we would have 8, 10, 12 authors on each paper that we put out, because it would turn out, I'll help you, you help me, and we'll all put our names on a bunch of papers. So many arguments. So again, today we're really cutting back on that. Those papers that had a dozen or so authors, that's less so today than it once was. Certainly we know the big clinical investigative studies, they will have a lot of authors, a lot of different centers. But when you look at other studies, we don't want all that. We want only people that have really contributed to the study to be included as authors. Formatting, et cetera, whether it be font size, spacing, all those types of things. Again, just read the instructions for your particular journal. And the cover letter is so important. Just like I said earlier, the introduction, that's like the sales pitch. I said the discussion may be the most important part. And I said the title is the hook that brings people in to even go any further with it. Well, the cover letter to the editor is everything. You want a cover letter that goes to the editor that editor will not be able to turn down your manuscript. So you want a very succinct, maybe just a few sentences that says what makes this case report so special. Because again, if the editor doesn't like your cover letter, that's the end of it. It doesn't go to the reviewers. It doesn't go anyplace. That's just the end of it. And these are just basics. I'm just going through the really basics, grammar, spelling. Certainly the co-authors, they have to not only read it, they have to give their okay before the final submission. And so again, you can't be a co-author just by only reading and making grammatical corrections. You have to do much more than that, but they do have to do that as a minimum. That co-author, no matter what he or she's role, has to be able to actually back up. In other words, if you went to a national meeting and one of the co-authors was there along with you, and maybe you're one of the major authors or a senior author, that co-author that maybe had a much more of a minor role has to be able to back up whatever's presented that day. So they have to feel very comfortable with the material. Every once in a while somebody will find out, gosh, I'm a co-author on a paper. I never even knew that. Somebody comes up and they ask them a question about it. They didn't even know that they were an author on the paper. Those days are long gone, hopefully, by now. So just some hints and tips again. Who is the first author? That's the one that does the bulk of the work. Who is the senior author or the final author? That's typically the one that is the overall. Without he or she's resources, this wouldn't take place. Maybe they're the one that has the laboratory, or maybe they have the other things that allow the experiment or the paper to be written. And then there's a host of people in between, what we call the co-authors. And again, looking at consultants and things like that for case reports. And again, discuss the authorship ahead of time, because it can lead to some big arguments otherwise. Okay, and then plagiarism. Again, it happens. I mean, everybody in the room is aware that they have the software now to see for plagiarism. Sometimes when you get into these very unique cases, maybe like case reports, maybe there's only so much you can say, so it may look like there's plagiarism when there really isn't, because there's only certain ways you can actually present it, but they're pretty good about that. Okay, so again, the list of the style we've talked about there, is it at the Vancouver style, is it the Harvard style, whatever style they're using, you have to follow that. And then a rule of thumb is less than 12 or 15. Some people say 15. I've seen the New England Journal of Medicine, they'll allow you up to 25 references, 25. Make sure they're relevant. What do I mean by that? Make sure they're contemporary. If you're going to have really an old reference in there, you might do it because it's of a historical interest, not because it's so pertinent to today. So again, make sure they're very contemporary, those references that you list. So again, I've told you earlier, again, what are you looking for in a journal? The one that has the audience you want, the field that you want, the impact that you want. Again, those are the things that you're looking for. So what happens? So after you actually turn in your manuscript, then they're either electronically or a postcard. Somewhere they're going to let you know that, hey, we've received your manuscript. Now, what's the time frame on that? Usually, if everything works right, within 6 weeks, they're going to give you thumbs up or thumbs down on your paper, which way it's going to go. Now, and I think everybody in the room is very aware, you can't submit to that second journal until you get some kind of response from the first journal. Now, if you haven't heard for some reason, because they do get quite backed up sometimes within 3 months, then you need to go ahead and contact them as well. Here it says 1 to 2 revisions. I've seen sometimes it may take up to 3 revisions to finally get what you need done. You know, the people that actually review your papers, they're experts in this area. A lot of times you won't know who they are, but if you have a very select area, you get an impression very quickly who that could be that's reviewing your paper. So follow their guidelines. They've got some very good questions, and just try to answer those questions the best way that you can. Most case reports will find a home. I mean, it may not be the New England Journal of Medicine or that prestigious journal you were hoping to put it into, but certainly maybe another journal that has less readership, less impact as far as the type of articles it receives. Certainly you're going to find a home for your thing. So again, be persistent, be faithful, continue on, try again. And again, for the most part, these articles will be published. So again, that's just briefly an overview. Again, some of these same concepts you'll see later on, but they'll be a lot more precise because they have to be an original research in that. So I'm presenting it from a case report standpoint, which is a little bit more leisurely, a little less precise. Thank you. Any questions? Again, thank you.
And let me just ask, are any of you planning to write a case report soon? Okay, what about, can you tell us about the case or why you think it's important?
Defined subject yet, and there's not much literature regarding it. Oh, this is that's cute. It's about breast implant illness, which is something that's new to, it doesn't have its own name yet. It's basically when a woman has breast implants put in, after some period of time she starts developing random, it seems, symptoms that tend to subside immediately after explantation. So I was going to do a case series of 1 or 2 of these cases just to put out the name to kind of pave a way for other research that we are planning on doing, including a retrospective and a prospective study that one of my colleagues is doing.
That's certainly an excellent example of what we've been talking about this afternoon. Excellent.
That's a good first step, to do a case series, like you said, and then do a further study later. I just want to, I've edited a lot of case reports, and just a couple tips. Make sure that you have the units for all your lab results. I can't tell you how many abstracts I've seen. Even a blood pressure, you should put millimeters of mercury. You may forget about that, but you always have to put the unit for all your lab results. Also, I know all of you talk about past medical history, but I always get rid of the word past because it's redundant. If it's history, then it's in the past. But I know it's a phrase all of you use, right? Sometimes I'll even get rid of the word medical, because you can say the patient presented with a history of diabetes, hypertension. And we know it's medical because it's a medical case report. So think about unnecessary words. A lot of times you have like Dr. O'Brien was saying, you have only so many words that you can put in your abstract or in your case report. And so you want to make sure, especially with the abstract, that every word counts, and so that you're under the limit. So that's just a couple tips I have from what I've seen. I'm sorry I wasn't facing the camera there. I know we got our satellite audience. I think they just had my back, but sorry. So thank you, Dr. O'Brien. And let me read the biography of our next speaker. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Virginia Yulee. She joined the Oakland University William Beaumont School of Medicine in 2012 as Assistant Professor of Nutrition in the Department of Biomedical Sciences. She is responsible for the development, integration, and assessment of the longitudinal nutrition curriculum. She earned her graduate degree from Wayne State University in nutrition and food science with a minor in physiology. She completed her postdoctoral fellowship in clinical laboratory biomarkers associated with health risks in the Department of Internal Medicine at the Karmanos Cancer Institute in Detroit. Her research focuses on the role of nutrition in the prevention and treatment of chronic diseases such as obesity, cancer, and diabetes. She's an expert in nutrition assessment methodology, measurement of clinical laboratory biomarkers associated with dietary intake, and medical nutrition therapy for obesity, diabetes, and cancer. She's also actively involved in national, state, and community committees that review and establish guidelines for medical education, nutrition, wellness, and health risk assessments. She'll be speaking today on writing an abstract for a scientific meeting. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Yulee.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Okay. If I talk too soft, please just raise your hand and let me know that you can't hear me. I'm just recovering from a cold, and I just got my voice back, actually. So I review a lot of abstracts, so I want you to know in general for either poster presentations, oral presentations, or journals. And in each case, the reviewers are actually given a rubric, so you should be aware that what I'm going to talk about are sort of hints and tips, but the reviewer is asked to actually rank in each one of these sections what they feel about your abstract. So that's a really important thing to remember. So when they give you specific guidelines and say you should follow this, follow that, because the reviewer is forced to then look to see, did you follow it, and how are they going to rank this particular abstract submission. It's sort of similar in each case. So this is long after you've collected all of your information, and now you want to present something. You either want to attend or go to a conference, and you want to be able to present either in an oral format or as a poster presentation, or you want to submit for publication. All of them are going to require you to write an abstract. And it sounds easy. I can tell you it's very hard. It's very limiting, and you have very few words to describe what you've just spent your last year actually investigating. And it doesn't matter if it's a case report or it's something that you did for QI or it's something that you received funding for to do research. It's still this one little piece, and many people agonize on this. So just think about the basic hints that I'm going to provide for you. I should also point out for this presentation, there are others that have presented before me, very similar information, and so I've sort of taken their information and incorporated it into my presentation here. So things that you have to remember when you're thinking about writing an abstract is you have to make sure that you're going to grab the attention of the reader. You've already heard about this from a previous speaker, and you want to make sure that you're following the abstract guidelines, and you want to be as succinct and logical in how you present this information. So if someone gets lost in your abstract writing, they're not going to look at the rest of your information that you're trying to publish. So you're going to write it very briefly. Again, an abstract is meant to be very small, but it is an independent statement, and it is considered separately from the rest of what you're going to present. So it does also allow for people to evaluate what have you actually done? What is your work? What research have you done? And how well have you organized that research? And how easy is it for someone to follow what you actually have done? And I'll show you some basic tips of the trade on how to best do this. And also, most importantly, how to point out what your key findings were. So it's really difficult if you start out with a brief introduction and then the next two sentences are about something that has nothing to do with your introduction. It's not that it wasn't important, and it's not that it wasn't part of your research, but it wasn't logical and it didn't follow. So the reader has a real hard time and gets lost in what it is you're trying to tell them. So the basic constructs, and this is very simplistic. I'm going to give you some other ideas about what fit into each one of these, but it's why did you do this? How did you do it? What did you find? And so what? What does it mean? So keep that in mind as you go through and try to write your abstract. It also is something you should keep in mind when you're writing the actual paper, if it's something for publication. But that's what people want to know. What is it about what you did that is so important for them to read or use as a reference? So there are different abstract styles, and you should become aware of what they are, and there are different things that a reviewer is going to be looking for. And so make sure you know what the rules are. If you don't know what the rules are, contact either the journal that you're trying to publish in, or contact the conference that you want to submit to and find out what are the rules, what are they expecting. And again, the styles are going to change depending on where you're submitting this abstract to. And there are guidelines that you can find in general, and I have the references listed up here so you can get sort of ideas of what is expected maybe and what's not, and what changes if it's going to be a research abstract versus a clinical vignette. But in general, they look something like this. So they expect that you're going to submit something that has a title. You have a list of authors and the institutions that they're from. You have an introduction of some sort. You have a method section. You have a results section. You have a summary section with conclusions. And it depends on where you're submitting, whether they're asking for any references or acknowledgments. So if they have a very short space, they're not going to expect the seventh thing that's listed here. They're going to just expect an abstract, and you may not include references at that point. For clinical vignettes, this has already been reviewed for you, so it's fairly similar. So you'll look at the structure, it's pretty similar. You may change the terms a little bit, but they basically, you're still including some basic information in both. Clinical vignettes, same thing, still including basic information. So you're more, perhaps in this case, more of a narrative, but you're actually giving examples, and you want to make sure that people understand what is it that you're writing about and why is it important. So in the body of an abstract, you start with the title, and that can sometimes be something really important. It depends on the journal that you're submitting to, whether they want a catchy title or not. From a reviewer standpoint, I like to read something that looks like someone gave a lot of thought into that title, and it helps me to understand what the rest of the abstract is going to be about. You want it to be clear. You want it to make sure that you have something that indicates the findings that you have, and you want to make sure also that it's going to grab the reader's attention and place them in a direction. So it sort of sets them up, so what am I going to learn if I read this abstract? And here are examples of some clear titles. So if you read these titles, you would clearly know what the abstract is about. If I make it too fuzzy, and I just make it very broad, then it makes it very difficult for me to figure out what am I looking for in the rest of the abstract. You can use active verbs, and in fact, they tell you to do this because it's something that draws the reader in a little bit more and actually also directs them into where you're going. So just using some verbs that add to the title doesn't necessarily take away from the title or change what it is you're trying to say, but it puts people in the direction of where you want them to go. I've seen a lot of this listed in literature where they consider these to be boring titles. I also know that there are some journals and some societies that actually like boring titles, but they don't draw the readers in as well. So this is an example of the same case, but they present it in a different way. So boring would just be a very basic information about what it is. The better one, which actually puts someone into shows them direction about what this is actually about, it gives more information, is one way to go. And remember, you're limited in the abstract, so sometimes you can put additional words in the title that don't go in the body of the abstract. Sometimes they're both combined, and then you have to count those as your word count, but other times they're separate, and so it's a way of adding more description to what you actually did. So again, you also want to think about how you might grab someone's attention, and it's your information, and these are just examples of things that might draw someone in a little better. Again, same idea. You didn't change what you did. You're just trying to get the reader and put them in a direction of, why did I do it? Or what was my question? You also have to keep in mind that there is a structure, and I already mentioned this, that there's an introduction, you're going to talk about objectives, and you're going to talk about backgrounds, and you're going to include things that sort of set up why you did this study. You're going to include background information as well, but I think it's really important for you to focus on the last sentence here, that you all are going to do all of that in 1 or 2 sentences. So it's not like writing the rest of the manuscript, where you have lots of words that you can use. Here you get a couple sentences to describe a large amount of information. So you have to really choose your words wisely. You also have to include information about your study design and methods. And again, you don't get a lot of space to be able to do this. So think about what directly describes what I did, what is important to include here, and what am I going to include that I can expand upon in the rest of the article. So in the abstract, you want the basic facts, and you want to make sure that the person is able to understand what it is you did, and that the methods make sense. Sometimes the methods don't make any sense when someone's reviewing your abstract. You may be able to describe that later on, why you did it, but if you're doing something unique, which is why most often we want to share our information, you need to describe that in your methods section, because it may not be intuitive to the person that's reading it. You also want to make sure that you don't put too much. You don't have a lot of space, so that's pretty easy sometimes, but make sure you're not cluttering your design. So you may think it's really important and really exceptional, and maybe that's something you can write in your discussion, but maybe it's not something you should include in your abstract. And maybe you can briefly make a comment about it there, and then later on you have more time to actually explain that. And again, you want to somehow be able to get down to the bottom where you're convincing the reader that they can trust the results. So you did your homework. The methods make sense. The study design makes sense. What you put in your title makes sense. Your introduction, you've done your background research, they all make sense. And so the end point is that they're going to trust the results based on what you've told them. You can present results in different manners. It depends on what it is, which journal you're actually working with. And you should look at journals if you're submitting for a publication. If you're submitting to present at a society, look at what those abstracts look like and sort of follow that as not necessarily a rule, but an idea of what they're expecting from you. So you can, depending on what kinds of results you've actually collected, you can put them either as a narrative form, you can do it graphically, you can put it as a tabular form. Make sure that you label it so somebody understands what is there. If you're going to use some type of table, label that table so it's easy for someone to figure out just by glancing at it. Again, you should also make sure that you are listing things in a logical manner so that somebody can actually follow what you did and that you're not jumping around from one section to another. So don't start out by talking about your results in the very beginning. Logically set up, talk about the study, how it was designed, what you did, and then your results should follow that. And this is just an example of integrating something into an abstract. Some people think it takes up too much space, so they don't like to do that. Others think that this is much easier for someone to read. So as you're reading through what you've written as an introduction, what your hypothesis was, what your methods are, there's always this results section that's sitting there. So you can see as you're going through from the very beginning, reading the title, you could jump and actually look at, okay, they have results here that seem to fit with my title. And then you can logically figure out how someone actually progressed. Actually have something to do with your title. I can't tell you how many abstracts I have reviewed that the title had nothing to do with what the conclusion was, and it was very frustrating to me. They should have included the information from their conclusion up in their title as well. So it's not that it was wrong. That is the conclusion that they came up with, but their title didn't reflect that. So they really have to go together, and it's really important that you do that. And I know from every rubrics that I've used to actually review abstracts, that is one of the questions that they're going to ask the reviewer. If they do ask you to include references, I'm sure that there are others that are going to talk about this, but these are just, there are different examples, and make sure you know that what the society is expecting, so wherever you would like to present, or the journal themselves, what do they want those references to look like? Because they do change depending on where you're actually submitting. If there are acknowledgments, again, you want to make sure you're following the rules. You need to understand how you're going to recognize people and what is expected from whichever journal or professional society that you are submitting to. And I really believe it is important to acknowledge if you have other people that are working with you on your project. They may not be an author, but they may have had some significant portion of what happened during that research, and it is important to identify them. There's usually instructions to authors, and again, strictly follow those guidelines. If I didn't say anything else today that made any sense, this is the one that you should remember. If you don't adhere to the guidelines, you may have an absolutely fantastic research project, but it may not get published, and you may not get invited to present it because you didn't follow the guidelines that they requested. Questions usually come up once you've written out everything you have. You have this large body of data and information set, and now you have to put it into this really short, compact abstract. And so you have to start thinking, I call it creative writing, of how are you going to actually do that. So how do you shorten your sentences? And it's just, it depends. You may have to read it and reread it and sort of get things changed around. It may not be the grammar that you were taught to use in the past, but it's a way to fit in with their guidelines, and it's acceptable. So these are just examples of how you might say the same thing, but not use as many words. And make sure which tense you're using. You should use an active voice. You also don't waste words either. So this is an example of saying things like, in order to determine. You don't need to use all of those words. You can say to determine. You can just get to the point. Also, you need to think about other words that you could shorten. So instead of using in addition, everyone likes to use that, you might use the word also. And again, not later than, but you can say by. So you really need to come up with ways. You look at the abstract, if you're over the limit, you need to then go back and sort of wordsmith and figure out what can I use in place of that. Also, again, you may be used to writing very descriptive sentences. In an abstract, you may have to really shorten that, so you want to get to the point as quickly as you can. And this is just an example of going from 23 words to 15, and that can be significant. Again, different ideas about how you can shorten. And then tips that you need to think about when you're writing your abstract. You have to think about the fonts, and sometimes there is a specific criteria that they will tell you you must use, so that's something for you to think about. You need to adhere to the guidelines, and you need to make sure that you have read all of the guidelines. Anything that is not within the guidelines will be in the rubrics that the reviewer is actually looking at, so they will catch that, and so they will mark that as something that didn't follow. And it does take a long time to write an abstract. It takes longer to write an abstract, at least for me, than it does to write the entire manuscript. And most of it is the frustrating idea of how to get that whole manuscript into this small item. And what you're really trying to get in that abstract are the big points of what you found. And let's see. Again, he already mentioned, the previous speaker mentioned a little bit about abbreviations. You need to be careful about how many of them you use. So it may make sense to you, it may not make sense to anybody else. In an abstract format, be very careful. If you have very big words, like the example I have here, it's obvious that it would be easier for you to shorten that. It also helps with your word count, but be careful. Don't put 12 of them in your abstract so no one understands what it is that you're trying to do. Also think a little bit about how you're describing things. So if you're describing methods and results, those are things that were in the past tense. If you're describing your discussions and your conclusions, that's something that's in the present tense, and make sure that you're describing it that way. And the most important thing I've found is having several people actually read what you have written and evaluate it is very helpful. Because again, you know exactly what you did, so when you read it, it makes complete sense to you. The reviewer that's going to look at it may not be familiar with your work, and so they're going to be guided based on what is written there. So have other people actually read what you've written. Also, make sure when you're looking back through that it is in logical sequence. So the transitions are logical. People can follow. Again, it doesn't jump around, and it makes sense. So it builds on itself. Qualities of a good abstract, most of them I have already described to you. Make sure that it's understandable, and I would underline that. Make sure that it avoids things that someone else outside of your field would not understand. So they would understand the science behind what you're presenting, but they may not be in your field. So make sure that you describe clearly what it is that you've done. These are the leading reasons why abstracts are actually rejected. Again, it doesn't mean that the study was wrong, that the results were incorrect, someone disagreed with what you did. It means that you didn't follow usually the guidelines, and sometimes it's because there was a significant flaw in a study design. So the study design didn't make sense. And I recently have had several of these that were sent for publication, that the study design itself was the problem. The rest, the methods they used, the analysis they used, everything else was just fine, but the design itself was flawed, and so it was really difficult to interpret the data that they actually presented there, because the study design itself really wasn't designed to collect what their conclusion was. So it was very difficult. So make sure that it all follows and fits together. You've already heard a little bit about what to do with authors, and that you have to be very careful about how you list your authors. Many publications now actually contact all the authors, and the primary authors actually ask to write a statement about the contribution of each authors that are listed on your publication. So that's important to keep in the back of your mind as well. And again, make sure that only individuals who've made substantial contributions to the work are actually listed there. I used to use this term called ghost authorships. I think that still is flying around, where these are people that never saw this, but you may have been part of their lab, and so their name was there. So they need to be intimately involved in what happened with your actual research. Again, there's a checklist, just things to think about and keep in the back of your mind. Information that you need to have assembled before you start writing the abstract. And this is actually my last slide, but this is an example of how abstracts might look that are all submitted to the same journal or professional society. Most of the time, as a reviewer, I'm sent somewhere between 10 to 15 abstracts. It depends on the society or the journal. And I'm going to look at these and make a decision, first of all, about which one I might read first. So I'd just like kind of to get a poll from you. If you were to look at these as a whole, A through H, which of these would catch your eye first, that you think might be pretty easy for you to read and understand? I'll start with A. How many think A would be something? Okay, I've got a few people that like A. How about B? Not too many want to look at B. How about C? How about D? Okay, pretty similar to A. How about E? E looks pretty tough to read. I'm going to agree with you. How about F? Okay. G? All right, and H. 4H. Okay. So it looks like most of you would be really happy with either A or D. And I want you to think about that, because not everyone does that when they are submitting an abstract. But it definitely looks like you could have something to refer to while you're reading the title, you're reading their introduction, you can consistently look at their results, and it's fairly easy. And again, what you want the abstract to do is grab the attention and also describe what you did. And I think for me it would be D. D tells me a lot. I feel real comfortable with D. I like A. There's two things that I have to look at, so it's going to be, I have to really interpret what's in both of those to do that. It doesn't mean that it's wrong. And there's also a table there, so there's a lot of information about results. And I may not need to know that much in my abstract, but it's still, it's informative, and that's what you're really looking for. And that's it. Any questions? I had the easy part. I have the smallest part of what you're going to do.
Thanks, Dr. Uli. Okay, we're going to go right into our next speaker. Yes. Yeah, you can stand up in place and stretch. We're not really going to take an official break right now, but feel free to stretch. Thank you.
Guys, could you pass it to the next row?
Okay, while we're loading up the slides here, I'm going to give an introduction to our next speaker, who is Dr. Daniel Keys. He'll be speaking on oral presentations and use of AV communications. He's Associate Chair for Academic Affairs in Emergency Medicine. He is board certified in internal medicine, emergency medicine, and medical toxicology at St. Mary's here in Livonia, right where we're at today. His MD is from UCLA, and his Master's of Public Health is from Harvard. He was full-time emergency medicine faculty at the UT Southwestern in Dallas before coming to Michigan. Dr. Keys has authored and co-authored numerous publications in medical toxicology, thromboembolism, geriatric care, and related fields. He's also created an online tool that all of you can check out. It's called CoolResearcher, all one word, .com, that can help you design your next research project. So join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Keys.
Thank you so much. Okay, greetings everybody. This is a long time to go through all of these lectures, try to absorb all this stuff, sitting there. You get a little bit of water to try to propel you forward. I am going to advertise this form. It's something that's available to anybody who wants to use it. If you've ever been a mentor, you know that people show up and they'll show up in your office, they'll say, well, I have a research idea, what is it? I want to look for what will cure cancer or something like that, And so then it takes about 10 sessions from them to hone it down, or maybe 5, into an actual doable project. So the idea behind this form is it helps you, I don't have the whole form up obviously, but step by step to go through a question if you have one, and you can email it to your mentor at the end, and you get a copy, they get a copy, and no one else gets a copy. So just something you might want to take a look at. So I'm going to talk to you for a little bit about how to present your research. And so the idea is that now you've done your project, you had an idea, you developed it, you went through the IRB, you got results, you collated those results and analyzed them. You made the abstract that Dr. Uli was teaching you how to do just a few minutes ago, and you were accepted at the conference. So now you have to go to the conference. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to put together a presentation for, a platform presentation for your project. Now, after me will be someone who will talk to you a little bit about poster presentations. So we'll get both angles. There's a lot of overlap between the two, but each one has its advantages. I just want to tell you that, point 1, outline your talk. Point 2, Identify one or two key super points. Point 3, format your data. Design a talk, practice, deliver. Was that real effective, me just staring at the slide? I'm not even looking at you, and I'm just reading everything that's on my slide. Just a pointer that you shouldn't do that. You should never be just reading your slide. I do want to give some thanks, and I urge you to do the same when you do a project. Probably at the end is a more commonplace. I had some help with developing this from Dr. Wilmean's slides. He's now a program director in Florida in internal medicine. And some other online resources that I used that were kind of helpful, I thought. All right, years ago, I was a scout, and they told us in our little leadership training course back then that you should tell people what you're going to tell them, tell it to them, and then tell them what you just told them. I don't know, there may be some validity to that, something that you might want to do. Maybe the key points that you want to get across, not your entire discussion. One thing that you do need to think about when you give any talk, doesn't have to be just for presenting your research, is think about who you're speaking to. It might make a difference, for example, if you're at a big general meeting with lots of different specialties, you're going to have to deliver content that everybody can understand. And so you might not be as sophisticated, as detailed as you might be if you're going to a subspecialty meeting where everybody kind of knows your field and you can focus right in on exactly what your project is. Try to find something that's really appealing to them. You're going to try to convince them that what you're doing is important. We'll get into that a little bit more in just a minute. Try to keep it focused. So you got a little bit of an introduction just now on how to design an abstract, and this is not all that different. This is the classic 10-minute oral abstract presentation. In years past, it was always 10 minutes on the podium and then 5 minutes for questions. And what everybody fears is not that prepared, slide set that you have, you practice and you have it down. Everybody is absolutely panicked, typically, about those 5 minutes when anyone can get up and ask a question of you. So that's what you need to do is you have to prepare your talk and also prepare for what people are probably going to ask about your talk. And I'll go into that a little bit more. Here's one sort of structure, the usual structure that's used, an introduction of some kind, methods, results, discussion, and conclusions. And sometimes people call that the IMRAD method because of these, there's no A in there. I guess you have to make it a little A to sort of remember that structure. But, basically you already have structured your abstract in that form, so you probably will also be doing your talk in about the same way. I can get this to advance. And so this is what you start with. This is what you're going to be looking at. You say, well, I've got to put something on that screen. So what am I going to put on that screen? This is like the worst point, right? Okay, I have to do this. I've got to put something together. I don't have any slides. What am I going to do? So the first starting point is going to be with your abstract. Won't belabor that point. Dr. Yulee talked about that at some length. It has the same kind of a structure. You can follow that same structure when you're putting together your presentation. So start with your background, right? We said we're going to start with your background. So take a look at this. So dedicated senior emergency departments are becoming more common in the U.S. Many SEDs, I was trying to cram it in to try to get, meet the criteria of the abstract, character requirements. Screening for depression in seniors. These departments feature enhanced screening, et cetera, et cetera. Does this look like an effective slide to present with? I see a lot of people saying no. So what's wrong with it? It's all crowded, it's full of words, so what you want to do is try to break this down and make it into some bullet points that are coherent. And again, you're not reading your slides, but you're going to paraphrase what you have up on the screen and let people know what your message is. Now, what are you doing in a background? In a background, we talked about sort of a hook. What you want to do is convince the people in your audience that what you're talking about is really important. You want them to think, this is a major problem. The U.S., we spend $10 billion a year on this problem, et cetera, et cetera. So your first point is to say, why is this so incredibly important? Probably to tell them what is known about this, and what you propose to add to the fund of knowledge in this particular item that you're studying. So this is probably a little bit more effective to do something like this. You'll then move on to your methods. And so you want to keep it to a minimum but no more, if you will. I don't, you know, use, if you can, just like we talked about with the abstract, with Dr. Yulee mentioned, we try to put some imagery in there. You know, the whole thing about an image is equal to 1,000 words, right? You want to include some key elements, your research design, you know, what kind of interventions you did you randomize, et cetera, et cetera. It depends on your particular project. Describe your population. These are things that probably the reviewers are going to want to know at the meeting and when you submit a manuscript, which should be your ultimate goal. There was someone much more famous than myself who said that everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. I think that applies, you know, to the methods. You do want to have everything in there. And this very old photograph proves that Albert Einstein was familiar with SEMCME, and also the coolresearcher.com website, so in case anybody was wondering about that. All right, then you're going to want to do your results. You've heard about this. We've discussed it during the day. Various speakers have talked about it. Try to include some imagery. We're going to give you some examples about that, and data tables, figures, images. Somewhere in there, you're going to usually have p-values or confidence intervals. That's talking about a research presentation. I know that many of you will be doing case reports. That's a whole different ballgame. In that case, you're going to describe your, your experience with that case, and there won't be any p-values or confidence intervals. We could go into more depth about which is better, and the answer to that is probably confidence intervals, but it's probably a topic for a different venue. Try to use as many images. Tables are good too. They can be very good if they're properly labeled. When you're giving a presentation, if you put a table up, you need to explain it to people. And sometimes you can put an arrow to your main point, things to make it very clear, because people don't have that much time when a slide is up. And once it's gone, they lose that opportunity to sort of figure out what your image is. How many of you have been to a meeting? Let me ask you this. Everybody hold up your right hand. Okay, now put your hand down if you've never presented at a meeting before. So really, it's like two-thirds of you. Two-thirds of you have actually done this before. So you know what I'm talking about. You've probably been at meetings where people talk and there's something goes up there and you're going, wait, you're trying to figure it out, and they move on to the next slide and it was just too complex for you to actually figure out what the slide was. Yeah, if I could only have understood that slide, I would understand this entire project that they're presenting. Try to put a caption under it, keep it simple, and I'll give you a few examples of that to try to help out with. So here's one that I actually slide on here. I think it's pretty good. It's people looking at, ability to read health-related words. They did a study, and they're showing two different cohorts in the population with different colors in order, self-reported and measured, and so trying to make a point here. Very nice, actually. It has this three-dimensional. It can make its point. It's not too cluttered. It really has. It can be, especially if you take a moment to describe it and explain what you're looking at. This would be a very good image to include in your talk. What about this? This is the same study looking at readability of patient material. Any comments about this one? People like it. People don't like it. How many like it? Nobody likes it. Yeah, I think I agree with you. This one's pretty tough. This one has, if I can get back to it, the contrast is pretty poor in that. Did you think that when you were looking at it? It's kind of hard to see what's going on. It's kind of cluttered. The key down here, there's no indication of which is which, between different, in this case, anticoagulants that are being used. Not a very good one. This is the same material being presented in a different way, where atrial fibrillation was put in red, warfarin in this color, low molecular weight heparin in another color. So much clearer, much more easily understood than the previous slide. I do want to make a point of caution to you, and that is that some people can't see red very well. About 8% of the population of males are colorblind, and about 0.5% of women are colorblind. It's much more common in males because it's on the X chromosome, and so that's quite a bit of your audience. I mean, what's that, 1 in 11 or something like that, 1 in 12 of your audience might not see those colors well, so be careful with red in particular. There are different kinds of colorblindness, but that's one of the more prevalent ones, red-green. Here's a table, and tables, you've seen tables probably that are extremely crowded and complex. try to be careful about those. Sometimes I'll see people throw up a big complex table and they apologize right away. So I know this is very crowded, but I want to make my point on this one part of the table. So you can get away with that. But it's probably better just to isolate the information that you want and make it, big and clear, and you can walk through it. Everybody in the audience can see it, even way in the back where at least half of you are still awake, and some of you haven't fallen asleep yet. So those people are going to need a lot more. This is a study we did. We did a study looking at, treatment of overdoses with Tylenol. What you do is it's Rumac-Matthew nomogram. Everybody familiar with that? Some of you, most of you. And one interesting thing about that nomogram is that you can't use the first 2 hours because when they did this 40 years ago, they just didn't even bother to start measuring until about 4 hours out because they felt it took some time to sort of redistribute. Well, we thought some of that information might be helpful in the first couple of hours, so we took people after 30 minutes. And what we found out is people overdose, they get, immediately when they get to the hospital, everybody thinks, oh, Tylenol level, acetaminophen overdose, Tylenol level. So they get one right away, and then they look at the nomogram, oh, it's no good because it's before 4 hours. So then they repeat it. Well, we took all of that data, and we decided to check if they were below a certain level, in this case 100 micrograms per deciliter, if they're below that level, per milliliter rather, then did any of them cross the line into the region that needed treatment? And you can see we cut each of these line couples, two of them together, before and after, and none of them crossed the line. So our point was that, yeah, actually you can use that data before 4 hours. So, with that, when you first looked at that, you probably said, wow, this is a Rorschach diagram. What in the heck is that? Totally confused, bizarre. But hopefully when I explained it to you, yeah, I can see that every single point ended up below the treatment line, so we could actually use that data before 4 hours that is not currently included on the nomogram. So that's an example of using an image to try to explain your research. This is looking at findings in ERCP, with acute pancreatitis. Certainly not my specialty, but you could see pretty good, what did they do here? Where did they get this table? What they did was they took it, you can tell they took it from the publication, right? This is from the publication. You can do that by using your screen save function. It's up on the upper right of your keyboard, and you can put it on your slide and crop it. I find it easier actually to put it on a Word document, crop it, and then move it over, because sometimes it's way off the slide, you can't find the margins. But you can do that and just check, just eyeball it. If it seems like the resolution's pretty good, like this one, you can certainly read that. Go ahead and pop it on there. It's kind of nice. It gives it a new dimension. It shows that it's actually been published. It just adds another element. Or it might be that you're giving background from someone else's journal article for your own project. Here's another one where we took that, actually they took the key data from that last one. It's kind of complex, and they decided just to hone in on what they wanted to make, the point they wanted to make, and put it right here on this slide like this. So it's much bigger, you can make your points, and perhaps that is better. I think you can do it either way. If you use the big slide, make sure it's not too small a font so people in the back of the room can still read it, and then explain it. Take time to explain what you're looking at. All right, what do you think about this one? Any takers? This is it's a flow chart, right? You have anti and GAP metabolic acidosis, the old mud piles mnemonic that everybody memorizes. So you look at the osmolar gap, I don't know, you can go different ways. Now, this is, an example of probably not a very good slide. What are the problems with it? Anyone can shout out, what do you think some of the problems are with this slide? Too small. Yeah, the font is really small. It's really hard. If you're anywhere in the back half of the room, you probably won't see the font. Too much information, too small, very difficult to follow. So take a look at this modification. This is the same diagram, but simplified a little bit, and the font has been increased. So now you can follow very clearly which way you want to go, what means what, and you can walk the audience through your points by using this diagram. And this is actually very nice to have as part of your presentation because it gets very visual. You can sort of easily conceptualize where you're going. This can be very helpful, but make sure that it's not like the former slide. How about this one? You have a CT scan study looking at and you describe what you see. Left lung has a large cavitary lesion, thickened walls, the pleura is involved. What could you do to enhance this? You know, obviously, right, have the image in there, you know, have something like this. You could have the same description that you gave in the previous slide, but instead just show them the image and describe it verbally. You know, a nice big red arrow. I always like those yellow arrows, don't you? You get from radiology, you know, it's a yellow arrow sign. I don't know if yours are yellow, but that's, you know, most places I've been, that's what it is. Anyway, you can describe it to the audience. You get to be the expert describing what you see, and they get to look at the actual image. Much better than just a few bullet points on a slide. Let's talk about font and color. Contrast is very important. A lot of people like to use white on a blue background. It's kind of a classic traditional one. It's certainly, you don't have to do what everybody else does, but it's a very common one. It's very clear. If you write in all caps, that is harder to read. And that's always been true. But nowadays, when all caps means you're screaming at somebody in an email or something or a text, it's even worse, right? I had a colleague once who used to write all of their entire history and physical in capital letters, the entire chart. It was like, wow, it's like the chart was screaming at you the whole time. Not recommended. Probably would avoid italics unless maybe you make it, if you use italics, what I do sometimes, I'll put it something I really want to emphasize, but I'll make the font much bigger or change the color so that the italics really show up. Bold is also harder to read. So, you know, keep it sometimes simple is better. Don't crowd your slides. Don't put too much on, 5 to 7 lines per slide. Don't make the lines too long. Have you ever seen people who have just crowded slides, too much information on every slide? You know what I'm talking about, right? You want to keep the slides simple as possible. It's probably better to change slides and move faster, have a few more if you can move faster, than having just a few slides with too much information on them. They talk about spending 1 minute per slide. In reality, today, that's probably too long. You know, think about the attention span now that with all the media that we have, a minute is like an eternity. So you might want to even move faster and just have more images, less information on each slide. I recommend you don't use those gimmicks. Have you ever seen like where something could come, you know, the words run across the screen and all of a sudden you hear a car braking and then a crash and, or, you know, those gimmicks don't go over too well, I don't think. You know, you got to keep it, you know, under control for the most part. Try to use a consistent theme if you can, although it's okay to throw one in if you, you know, sometimes people will do that with a, you know, borrowed slide that everybody kind of recognizes, and, you know, spell checking. All right, what about font? So I thought this was kind of nice to see. You can see back there, you know, what this looks like, what different font sizes look like. And typically, you should probably be at least 24 point or above. Probably 28 point is I would say stick to 28 and above. If you do that, keep the words to a minimum. Remember, you're not reading the entire phrase. You're going to paraphrase it, and you're going to be good at it because you're going to practice and go through your presentation a couple of times. And again, the same rule about capital letters. Don't make it all capitals. There are people who say, or some people say that if you have a dark room, dark blue or black background with white letters or bright letters is better. You know, you could think about it yourself that works a little bit better in a dark room, whereas a light slide with dark letters may work better in a brightly lit room. You know, you may or may not find that to be compelling, but this is sort of kind of a general accepted sort of practice. When you do this, you put together your project. Okay, now you have some slides. What I really would suggest is practice it, run through it, but also run through it with your mentor. That really, really can help a lot. If you can, try it in a similar setting. You know, when no one's here, you can come up to the podium, present your talk. Nobody's there. You can imagine that everybody's there, and give it a chance. Especially if you're not really familiar with this, the more that you do, standing up in front of people and getting used to it, it actually gets to be pretty exhilarating after a while. It can be really kind of fun. But at first, I think just about everybody has some stage fright when they first start out. And then as you do it more and more, it gets to be very comfortable to stand in front of a crowd of people and present. Do a backup copy. Oh, be sure that you have a couple of backups. I've been before in situations where everything falls apart. You know, the equipment's not working. you can bring a copy of your talk like I did here today. Now, in this talk, if I didn't have any images, it might be kind of hurt a little bit, I think. But you can you have a copy of your talk. If you have to, you can just give the talk from your notes. The other thing you can do with your notes, if you print up the notes, is while you're waiting, you can be reviewing things that you really want to review, that you're worried you might not get just right. You can have that paper copy. You can be doing it in the meeting while you're waiting for your turn to speak. So having a copy ready is a really good idea. I always like to have 2 forms, too. They asked me to email this talk to them, but I also brought it on my flash drive. And, of course, I made some changes since I emailed it, so I added some stuff in. But have a couple of different options so that you're back at, technical difficulties will arise, and they do. You've all seen it. So try to be ready for that kind of stuff. This is the printed copy concept. So one thing I would suggest is you can start with a memorized version, but try to get away from that. Get to where you're comfortable. You get comfortable and talk to people just as you would talk to maybe 2 or 3 of your friends. Get used to it. If you do it 2 or 3 times, you usually really feel pretty good. I've been doing this for years with residents, kind of buffing them to get them ready for conferences, and it really helps. Here's what really can help with your mentor, is if you ask your mentor before they show up to hear you practice it with them, to come up with 3 or 4 questions they're probably going to ask. I always try to make a point of doing that, and I would encourage you to get your mentor to do that, because that is what everybody fears. They all fear getting up there and dealing with the questions. So there are some tricks about questions, and I can tell you more about that in a minute. One thing I'm going to say to you is I told you not to memorize, but you can memorize sort of an opening statement. Hi, I'm Dan Keyes. The title of my presentation is, and you can read that verbatim because it is the title after all. I'll be talking about a new way to take care of the elderly in our ERs. So you make sort of an impact statement right at the end. That's a good way to sort of start things off as well. Try to look at your audience. One thing I'd like to emphasize with you is try to be excited about what you're talking about. If you're not excited about your project, do you expect anyone else to get excited about it? Of course not. You should have some passion about it. You had some passion about it when you thought up the idea and you went for it. Be excited about what you're talking about, and it'll be contagious. Everybody else is going to like it too. And don't find yourself in a monotone, looking bored, because you're certainly not going to get anyone else excited. It's okay if you sort of lose your way, just to pause for a second and think about it. One trick you can do for timing is to have a halfway slide and try to make sure that you get to that point at the appropriate time interval. I'd like to remind you too, not to apologize. You'll see people get up and say, well, I was asked at the last minute to do this, or my other person wasn't able to make it, so I'm going to do it. And so they start with an apology. I would encourage you not to do that. Just go ahead and dive in confidently, take ownership of it, even if there is some sort of mitigating circumstances that involves in your presenting that day. Try not to use the pointer constantly. People that use the pointer, a lot of times you see this like they're nervous or they're like, shaking because everything's amplified way out there, So, use it as necessary. This is one of my residents. She presented at the National Occupational Emergency Medicine meeting. Did an excellent job. Remember to acknowledge your mentor, previous researchers who contributed to what you did, anyone who helped you with the project. That's always very important. You'll close up with some conclusions, right? You'll have some conclusions at the end. Try to summarize in the context of the big picture why what you did makes a difference. And you always want to mention some possibilities for new research. I mean, you don't have to, but that's probably not a bad idea. If you have some people in the audience or something going on, say, for example, you're asked a question, and there's a couple of questions. Let's talk about question issues. Someone may ask you a question that is very difficult to answer or very involved. If you were to answer this question, it would take you a lot of time. So one thing you can do is say, briefly make a point, but say, what I'd like to do is come back to you later because it would take too long to really develop that thought. Another thing might be, I think I have another slide on questions, is if you don't know the answer to a question, what can you always say? I don't know. It's always, this can take away a lot of that fear about the questions at the end of your presentation. Just remember that you can always say, I don't know. That's a great question. You know, or that's something that we'll be needing to look at. I really like that question. It's not something that we address in this study. You do not have to have every humanely possible answer out there. No one can. Someone will ask a question that you just don't know the answer to. Another thing you can do is say, invite them to discuss it with you after the meeting. You say, I'd like to develop that more. Would you mind staying after the meeting or after the talk? And let's go over that a little bit more in detail. If you're running out of time, you have some backup ideas. You may want to, first of all, rehearse ahead of time with a timer. And there's an app. There's cool apps that have those lights that go on, like green, amber, and then red, and then flashing red. So these are free apps you can get. And you can just download them and practice with exactly the same number of minutes that you have at the meeting. A lot of meetings are doing 7-minute lightning presentations now so they can get more people to present. So you set it whatever the time is and get used to it. Keep a critical slide away from the end so that you don't run out of time and your critical killer slide is right at the end. You might want to put it before the end. And just practice and practice, I already went over some question issues. I don't think I said don't offend the questioner. I guess that goes without saying, but people do that. They kind of, get bothered. I already answered that, 5 minutes ago, something like that. Acknowledge good questions. I already told you this. Just always be willing to say, I don't know. So your major goal that I want to remind you of is after the meeting, you want to publish a paper, okay? That should be your ultimate goal. You do all this work, research, collating the data, writing the abstract, presenting at a meeting, and only about 30% of papers go on to actually be published. So try to, go on that long track, goal. Try to get something into the literature. One thing you can do is when people ask you questions, take note of what they ask. A lot of times the reviewers are going to want to know the same thing when you submit it to a journal. That's one reason why I actually like posters a lot too. On a platform, you can get 1, 2, 3 questions at the most in a very hurried setting, or you can stand in front of a poster and you can actually take notes or remember what people ask you as they walk by. You can get a lot more opinions. So usually platform presentations get a little more prestige. They're usually the more judged to be the more impactful research projects. But you know what? Posters are great because you can get a lot of feedback from people. So I really encourage you to do that. So here are a few take-home points. Be sure you practice ahead of time, get the timing down, the content. Make sure you get your mentor to ask some questions. Think of the questions ahead of time and don't have them tell you what they are. But when you finish your presentation, let them ask you those questions. And you could say, well, I'm not sure what I would say about that. And your mentor says, well, I was thinking you could say this or that. So try to get ready for those questions. You can always say you don't know, so that takes a lot of that fear factor out when you have to present at a meeting. It's what most people are worried about. Keep track of the questions and feedback that you get because you can use that in your presentation. And by all means, be excited about what you're talking about. So this is my questions slide. You can have one of these at the end. Usually you'll have your references and then you'll have some questions. But I want to show you another trick that's kind of cool. Tell me if you've ever seen this before. And that here you are, you're taking questions from the audience, and they ask you, what I'm not sure about, why would you ever do a study on acetaminophen in the first hours? It takes too long. And so you have a slide ready. I call it the secret slide. Afterwards, well, I'm glad you asked that. Here is the pharmacokinetic, these are the kinetics of acetaminophen, and you can see that acetaminophen on this dark line here peaks at about 30 minutes or an hour, so obviously no one would use it if it didn't peak very early on. So that's why we thought that you might check a level early on. So you can have your secret slide out there, so if someone asks you a question, anybody ever seen this before? Yeah, a couple of you have. Have a few ready in the background, things that clearly not the focus, the major content, you would have included that in your talk. But if you anticipate a question or two on this or that, you can pop it up and you have something ready. It always impresses the audience if you can do that. Well, that's all I have for you. Any questions before we move on? All right, I'll be available afterwards. I think are we having a break now? I do believe. So if you have any questions, come on up and we'll talk some more. Hey, I really want to thank you a lot. Nobody here was snoring loudly. Nobody fell asleep and slammed their head on the table, requiring sutures. You guys have been a great audience. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Keyes, for your enthusiasm. We're going to take a 10-minute break and come back, and we have one more speaker. Please don't leave. I know it's tempting to leave, but our last speaker drove in from Ann Arbor, and I know he'll want you to stay. So please come back from the break, and we'll wrap it up with our last speaker, who will talk about posters. Thank you. Okay, we're going to get started again. Thanks for sticking around. Our last speaker I'm proud to present is Dr. Anupam Saneja. He's a member of the SEMCME Research Committee, and he's the Associate Program Director for Research at St. Joseph Mercy Hospital in Ann Arbor. He earned his medical degree in India at is it Delhi University, and internal medicine residency in New York. He completed his fellowship in geriatrics and his MTH with a major in epidemiology, biostatistics at Boston University. After working as assistant professor of medicine at Boston University School of Medicine in Wayne State, he joined St. Joseph Mercy Hospital in Ann Arbor 4 years ago. His research role includes helping residents through design and conduct of multiple research and QI protocols, ranging from retrospective projects to randomized controlled trials. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Saneja.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to come present here. I've been presenting for the past few years, and I'm really glad that you stayed to the end of the session. I know it's snowing a little bit outside. More like rain in SEMCME. It's not too bad. But there were a few crashes along the way as I was coming from Ann Arbor. So as you head out, hopefully we'll end a little bit earlier and you'll head out with plenty of time. So just by a show of hands, how many of you are PGY1 residents? Okay. PGY2s or 3s? All right. Any fellows? Faculty? Okay. All right. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about posters and publications. If you've reached the point where you're about to make a poster, you're actually doing pretty well, right? You've had a research idea, you've talked it over with a mentor, hopefully a biostatistician or an epidemiologist helped you. You went through the data extraction, and now you're all ready to write it up. So if you really think about it, this is the culmination of all your hard work. So it would be a shame to do all this hard work and not present it somewhere, right? I do want to acknowledge Dr. Lampman. He's a PhD from St. Joe's Ann Arbor, who used to present this talk before me. So this is what it looks like. Right? You go to a national meeting, there are tons of posters, and you're one of the people presenting a poster. So why present how many of you have presented a poster before? Okay. How many of you have written a paper before? Okay, very good. So for the people who've written a poster or presented a poster, did you present it at a local meeting or a national meeting? National meeting? Okay. So what made you do a poster and go present it? What encouraged you to do it?
Big platform and very interesting case that I wanted to tell everybody.
Okay. So she said it was a big platform and she had a really interesting case she wanted to share. Somebody else who presented a poster, what made you go out and present a poster? Okay. So one of the things that I find that residents frequently have a reason to do this is because the fellowship match just happened, right? We had one person match into Brown, one went to University of Texas, and all the people who are kind of going into these places have done research and presented posters. when I was at Wayne, one of the residents, who I thought was like amazing, so she went to the nephrology conference. She wanted to go to nephrology, and there was a nephrology fellowship interest section, and she met the Cleveland Clinic fellowship director out there, right? So she was going to present a poster the next day. She met this fellowship director. They had a conversation about, hey, this is what I'm planning, blah, blah, blah. And then she goes, presents a poster. And then when she goes to the fellowship interview, that director's like, hey, I've seen you before. We talked about this poster, and it was so much better. And she got recruited into the fellowship program for nephrology. So this is a great opportunity to network, not just at the local level, but if you go to a national level, you get an opportunity to meet other fellowship directors as well, right? So fellowship could be a reason. It could be a platform to share your interesting research or case report. When do you start making your poster? So how many of you have had deadlines at the print shop, right? In our institution, it's about 4 weeks. So think about whenever your meeting is, 4 weeks from that is your deadline. Please give enough time to write it up. Now, if there are other authors involved, they need to kind of be involved in writing up portions and approving this. So give yourself plenty of time. I know residency is really busy, but if you don't plan the timeline right, then you've got the crunch time and everything's not going that well, and then the poster doesn't turn out as well as it could be. So everybody's familiar with IMRAD, right? Yep. So if you think about clinical notes, you think about SOAP notes, right? When you think about the ANSI standard for research presentation, it's IMRAD, Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. Fair enough? It's a standard, I think, that was set up in the 1970s or before. So for the case study, this presentation is not so much for case studies, but for the case studies, I'm going to show you something that won the award last year. Sorry. So you have your introduction, your clinical presentation, diagnostic workup, usually a CAT scan or two, some discussion. So this is the poster that won the ACP last year in the spring meeting, right? And this is a tenosynovitis caused by the new monoclonal antibodies. So if you think about it, the reason this is an exciting poster is because monoclonal antibodies are being used by internists, right? Or at least they have subspecialists using it, and the internists are seeing these patients in clinic. And so this is something that's breaking news for the internists who are judging these posters, right? And so now you come around and say, hey, there's an immunological problem that is caused by these monoclonal antibodies that you should be aware of. Suddenly the people who are judging these posters are going, wow, this is kind of interesting. I could see this in my clinic. And that raises the... She had only one picture of a foot, which I don't even think comes from her patient. There are a lot of other pictures in there. Posters tend to be a visual medium, right? So when you're thinking about posters, if you have a poster with a lot of words on it, it's not going to work. Fair enough? Have you ever seen a poster that's just full of words from one end to another? I've had one of those presentations. I judge for the ACP frequently, and I had one of those presentations. It was full of words, and this resident stood next to the poster and read every word. And I'm not kidding. And so what happened is I was standing next to this and knowing I could have just read all those words as well. There was no real explanation for what was happening. It was just word by word, the whole thing, right? But if you actually put an image up and explain to me why this monoclonal antibody is causing tenosynovitis, it could be a great learning opportunity for me, right? And it could be a way to capture the attention of the person judging you. Does that make sense? So when you start thinking of a case to write it up, think about what is it that sells that case to somebody else. What makes it interesting? As I judged for the ACP, one of the abstracts I saw was, with this medication, we report eosinophilia. 13% has been reported before, we report 14%. I was like, okay, great. So eosinophils go up with this drug. That's already known. And now we've gone up from 13% to 14%. Who's going to buy that, right? Why waste your time on something that you're going to make all this effort and make a poster, go there, present a poster, and the person's going to go, not buying it, right? So that's the thing. always look at the end. What are you selling? What are you telling us that will make it worth it? Does that make sense? Okay, so we're going to move to research. Now, most of the research posters look like this, right? There is your introduction, the methods, results, discussion, and then it could look like this, or look like this, or look like this. It doesn't really matter. It's the same concept. It's just boxes that are being moved around, right? References at the bottom or at the side. So I'm going to show you an example of something that won. Do you know, just before I change the topic, does somebody know what a serif font or sans serif font is? Okay, so this portion of the slide is an Arial font. How many of you think this is a serif font example? Just show of hand. Give it a shot. You have 50% chance of being right. That's better than most multiple choices. Serif, how many of you think it's a non-serif font? Okay, very good. So the sans serif font is something that actually does not have any of those little protrusions that the serif font has, right? It really matters which font you use for your poster. There are fonts that are comical, right? They're funny. There are fonts that are Gothic, right? And then there are fonts that we use in professional literature. Try to stick to a font that is usually used by your print shop. Usually, we'll talk about some of that. The other thing that frequently residents will do is they will take large fonts, and then as they start writing more and more, the fonts will start shrinking, right? And they're like, if I could just squeeze that extra 50 word in, I could make the references so small that somebody could look at the microscope and see what's going on, right? It's like, I just need to fit more words in. You don't have to, because you are going to be standing right next to the poster to tell us what's in the poster. Don't worry about putting every word in there. Put some visual stuff in there and talk to us about what it is that's making sense to you, right? Sell the poster. Don't just fill it with words. So use those font guidelines up there. 120 is great. 72 is minimum for title. Don't shrink the fonts down. If you're still trying to put more words in, look at the words and try to cut the words out. Now, SEMCME actually used to have a meeting. We used to do this at Meadowbrook Hall in the past. We've now moved to Henry Ford Village. So what happens is, for every hospital, there are 2 winners, and 2 winners get sent over, or 4 winners get sent over to the SEMCME meeting in spring and participate. Like, you compete against every other person from who's won in their hospital. So you're really dealing with surgeons and orthopedic and internal medicine and family medicine, all competing against each other to be the best. And there's a prize money and a trophy associated with it. We have changed those now. So is it Dr. Piper now this time who, like, the trophies after him? Yeah? Okay. So Dr. Piper is going to be one of the trophies that you get. It comes up with a large award. It's actually pretty good. Looks great on the TV. So this is a poster that won in the SEMCME a few years ago. I'm going to break this poster down into bits and we'll go over it, okay? So see how this works. Title. So the title that we used in our poster was Plasma Fluoride Level as a Predictor of Voriconazole-Induced Periosteitis in Patients with Skeletal Pain. So it turned out that, as you know, there was many years ago an epidemic thanks to contaminated steroids, as the steroids were put into people's spines. Unfortunately, lots of people got infected. And St. Joe's got a huge number of patients, and they got treated with Vori at doses that had not been used before, right? So CDC was involved. Voriconazole was being used at a dramatically higher dose. And it turns out, as the voriconazole was used, voriconazole has a lot of fluoride in it, and it started causing periosteitis, right? So that's what this paper is about. Now, at that time, when this poster was made, that was of interest to the people because everybody had heard about it in the newspaper, about this outbreak. And so they knew that voriconazole was being used, and nobody had reported the numbers that we were reporting, and it actually became a paper later on. So it needs to be succinct. We are in 2 lines. You should never cross 2 lines. It's not that succinct. Conveys basic scope of scientific material, right? Formatted in sentence case, avoid colon, Arial, or Helvetica font. So that's Arial font right there, sans serif font. Cool? Any questions up till now? Okay. Okay. All right. Any questions up till now? Okay. Authorship. One of the most important things is when you start doing a research project, figure out who's going to be the first author at the start of the project. You don't really want to destroy relationships later when there is a controversy about who's going to be first author. So one of the first things I do as we meet residents is we figure out who the first author is going to be, right? Do not undertake a project without the first author there. Now, people have to contribute to the project to be an author. You can't just put people on just because, they're friends or because you're going to be on their poster, maybe, things like that. Okay. We did not have an abstract. Introduction. So an introduction is a great way to bring the hypothesis, but it's also a great way to say, why should the person judging the poster actually care about the poster, right? So when you start telling the judge about the poster, the most important thing is not what words you put onto your introduction. It's about why should the person judging the poster actually care about the poster, right? For us, it was, hey, this is a meningitis outbreak that everybody has heard about. Vori is never been used at these doses, and so we're talking about that, right? For other people, it could be this new monoclonal antibody. Whatever it is, if your research project has a reason why it is of importance to you, share that importance with the person judging the poster, right? Bring that enthusiasm to the person reading the poster, and the introduction is the place to do it. Now, if you've ever submitted an ACP abstract, each of those sections, introduction, method, results, and discussion, actually have points assigned to it, right? So if you send in an abstract that does not have one of those sections, you actually lose points right away. So I am actually judging the poster, and I can't give you a point for an introduction that does not exist, right? So always make sure that the abstract that you're submitting, not the poster that you're making, but also the abstract that you're submitting, has all the sections that you need. Fair? Any questions about that? Okay. Now, materials and methods, again, since this is a visual medium, try to use flow diagrams, right? Did you design a case control? What is the arrows, one thing going to another? Is it a case control? Is it cohort? What is it that you designed? Put a drawing up there. So this is, as you can see, we actually have a drawing on the side. Results. If you're going to put X-rays or CAT scans, make sure that they're de-identified. We've had unfortunate situations where actually the name of the patient or the ID, everything is still on the poster. Not a good place to be after it's already been printed to find that the patient's name is on the poster, right? Like you have to go do this all over again. So make sure the identifiers are off. If you do put a CAT scan or something, don't assume that the person judging the poster actually knows how to read that CAT scan that you have, right? So saying, as you can see, doesn't help. Show them what it is that you think is important, right? Lead the person into the image that you've put up. If you're going to have tables, figures, graphs, those are the things that you put into the results section, not words, right? Okay, so this is what the results section looked like for us. There was a CAT scan, a table on the side, a bone scan, and then some graphs. Below those graphs and images, there was a small descriptive paragraph about what that image was showing, right? But if you did not have space, you could just show the images and the graphs and leave the description to you being on the side of the poster and describing it. Fair? Discussion. The important thing about the discussion is, let's say you had a hypothesis and it did not turn out to be correct. That's okay, right? The reason you did research is because there's equipoise, right? You did not know if the results were going to be positive or negative. Even if it comes back negative, that's all right. The discussion is about, here's what I had predicted, this is what we found, and the reason for why that finding was there, right? And conclusion. What is your take-home message? What is it that you started off with? Here was my introduction. This is what I really believe in. And then the conclusion is, I still believe in it, hopefully. References, acknowledgements. If you thank a person on the poster, please make sure that they've agreed to be thanked, right? So if you, no, I'm just saying that if you have a division head who's really known across the area for being a stellar ID guy, and you thank him, make sure that he agrees with whatever's on your poster before you thank him. Is that fair? Because you don't want him to be responsible for something that you believe in and he or she does not share. Future studies, follow-up research, email address. Okay. So in one slide, this is all the stuff that we're talking about, right? If you look at that thing in red, which may not be quite readable, 50% of the poster needs to be white space, right? So most of the area of the poster needs to be white space. So I was reading something in one of the books, and it said, a poster or whatever you're preparing, a diagram, whatever you're doing, it is ready not when you can add more words to it, but when you can't take any more words out of it, right? And the person who's most attached to the words is the first author. That's why you want a friend or somebody else to review it, because the person who wrote that always loves every word that they wrote, right? Because it takes a lot of work and sweat to put those words in. And so you need a dispassionate observer to go, you don't need these lines, you don't need these words. And it's really painful. It's like losing your firstborn to go, oh, but that was the best words nope, don't need it, right? Have somebody look through it. Do not underline, right? Do not make things bold. Do not capitalize. If you really had something important, maybe italics, but even that, use it in a minimal fashion. The more minimalist you are, the better it is, right? Hitting people on the head with an obvious message is not helpful. They'll figure it out as you present it. Okay, any questions about where we are right now? Because we'll see some examples and you'll see what the difference is. But any questions up to now? No? Yes, please go ahead. It's usually the case that references are there. It could vary whether you put it on the side or at the bottom of the slide. Usually you don't have to put every reference that you used. If there were like references that were crucial to your paper, then it would be worth putting it in. So not everything that you looked at, or at least some of them. Anybody with a different question? So she asked about, are all references important, or should you put references? And answers is generally, usually references are put in. It's just a question of how many you put there. Okay, so I took the person's, this is off the internet. I actually don't have permission to use it, but I took this person's thing off the net, and I was like, oh my God. Barriers, enablers, related strategies in relation to supported post-secondary education for people with mental health challenges, a pilot organizational case study. I was like, even reading the title seemed like a long, short, but then I looked at the rest of it and I was like, if this was what you were going to present, you would lose anybody, right? Like, who would want to read this as a judge, right? Now, the reason there's this excellent book called Death by PowerPoint, right? And I go to morning reports frequently, and there are slides full of words, and sometimes they look like that. And one of the things we've been doing in our residency is trying to take out words and put figures and images in, right? But this is a great example of what not to do. Okay? This actually, I have permission from Dr. Gordon to put this up. So this is a meta-analysis. I thought this was better than the previous one. At least it's broken up into sections, and it's got a forest plot on the side. It has the, doesn't say introduction, but has the methods, results, conclusions. Not as great, but not as great as this one. So I do have this, Dr. Green's permission to put this up. This is unrelated to medicine, but I thought it was such a beautiful slide. And the reason was, you know, he does a principal component analysis, and yet everything is diagrams and pictures. The colors are a little muted. It just flows nicely. It's got tons of diagrams that he could lead you through, right? Much easier to read this than this or this. Fair? Okay? And I love those pinks are just right, like just beautifully done, okay? But on the other hand, this may be a little too far, right? The colors are a little bit too jarring. It's too blue out there. The bottoms are not aligned. When you read the first line, you don't know, do I go right or do I go left? Do I go to the bottom? So I like this. It's much more divided into sections. It's got lots of white space or gray space, if you like. This one's just a little bit too much. All right. So the content of your poster is the most important, right? No amount of arts and diagrams and colors will make it better than the content that you started with. But if your content is good, then using appropriate colors, using the right diagrams will make a difference, right? Last few things about posters. Have an elevator. Do you know what an elevator speech is? So think about this. Like you go into an elevator with the CEO of your hospital or with the program director, and you have the elevator ride to pitch an idea. You should be able to condense your poster into an elevator speech, right? Think, because ultimately to get it down to a minute or two of spiel actually takes a lot of work. The second thing is, don't look at your poster when you're presenting it, right? Or in your morning report, don't look at the slide and read it. It's really important that you know what's on it, but don't keep looking at it as you present it. So one of the people who was presenting it actually had a pointer. So every time she read it, she would point to the word she was reading. And because the pointer was so bright, I couldn't read that word that she was pointing to. And I was like, if she would just shut the pointer off. And the content was actually pretty good. Her presentation just made it more difficult to follow. Do not use cards or slides when you're presenting, right? Like cards or index cards or little sticky notes. Know what you're talking about. You are the person who spent months getting this poster together. You shouldn't need references on your, little information cards to help present it. If you really think about it, the person who you're presenting to probably knows less about the subject than you do, right? If you think about program directors and people like that, or even fellowship directors, you are like presenting something that's, for us, for example, if who is presenting periostitis, fluoride-induced periostitis with voriconazole, even if you were an ID specialist, you'd never heard of it before, right? So he doesn't need a card to present it because you know more about that subject than anybody else in that room. If you're going to skip a few facts, you're going to skip a few facts. Nobody's going to be wiser that you skipped them, right? But the cards take away from the fact that you actually were the person who knew what was going on. So don't write things down. Just know your subject. Try to be next to your poster. So my son presented a poster for SEMCME. He's in high school. And he got a little note from, the Alumni Association from Yale sent him a little award. Those were not the people who were judging the SEMCME, right? But the people who could come to your poster and look at it could actually be the people who could make a difference later in your career, right? They could be a fellowship director. They could be important. So don't go away from your poster. I know there are other things that you could go to, but if you have a poster presentation time, stay there. You never know who you're going to meet. Okay? Networking, it's about networking. It's not just about presenting something. It's about networking as well. Stay there. Have a card and a handout about your poster ready, right? If somebody's interested in your work, your case that you thought was important, or the platform that you sought, somebody's interested in your work, give them a little handout so that they can take that with them if they're still interested, right? Give them a card. The number of times people will contact you may not be that many, but hey, you never know. That's the New York State lottery thing. Hey, you never know. I was in New York for residency, and that was plastered everywhere. And so it's the same thing sometimes when you're presenting. You never know who's going to stop by. So we're going to go from posters to papers. I know most of you are like, hey, we're never going to write a paper. Maybe we will. Posters are much more likely, but the paper section is actually much more concise. And we'll go over a few things and we'll be done. Any questions about posters? Wow, I didn't know I presented so well that there was so much clarity. There must be some question. Nothing at all? Okay, go ahead. No? Okay. Oh, thank you. I should have brought some chocolates or something. He's like, this was an excellent presentation. I was like, great. Thank you, I really do appreciate it. Okay, we're going to go over to papers. So it turns out there are lots of times when we make the effort to do a poster, and converting the poster to a paper is not a lot more work, right? So for example, the voriconazole periostitis could have easily died as a poster. The reason it went on to become a paper is Wu, our chief medical resident at that time, was just one of those driven people, and he would not let go of it, right? And so the one thing that you have to do is, if you've put in all this effort, think whether you can make a paper out of it. It's not as much work as you think. All right. So one thing that you do as you make a poster or a paper is it has to be an excellent, innovative idea, right? It's all about the idea. One of the biggest things, I was just on a Trinity-wide call with all these program directors from different places, and the one thing that I think we all kind of struggle with is how do you identify an innovative question that will make a difference, right? So if you go, I'm going to look at CHF readmission, been done 100 times, right? So one of the papers that we just wrote that I'm hoping will get published is we looked at PRISM, which is used at St. Joe's, and Seattle heart failure model as a predictor of CHF mortality, right? And it turns out that when you combine PRISM and Seattle heart failure model, the mortality prediction is the best. So we are hoping that somebody will be interested in it. I'm not sure. But try to find an innovative idea. Stay abreast of the literature. If it's already been done, there have been many times when you're trying to do a meta-analysis and it gets published a few months before we kind of sat down and did it. Most frustrating thing, but try to stay abreast with the literature. You don't want to work on it and find out somebody just did it. We've had that happen more than once. Talk to your consultants, experts, mentors, figure out ideas along the way. So as you become more and more seasoned clinicians, there will be ideas that you kind of go, why doesn't somebody know the answer to this? And that could be a good starting point. But talk to your consultants. Consultants usually know where the cutting edge is and where there are problems. Okay? If you're going to go find a mentor, okay, one faculty member, okay, so you can go here. For everybody else, if you're going to go find a mentor who's going to help you do research, make sure that they actually have some PubMed IDs behind their name, right? If somebody doesn't have a PubMed trail, the chance that they would be successful in their first paper with you doing your first paper is unlikely, right? So it's pretty easy. Go to PubMed, put their name in, see how many papers they have. Okay? Okay. Figure out the author and author sequence. We talked about that. Figure out who the first author is going to be. It's really important. Now, does your hospital have an epidemiologist or a biostatistician? I know St. John Providence does. Anybody else? Yeah. So if you have an epidemiologist or a biostatistician, talk to them before you collect your data. It's really difficult that you finish a project and go and find out that there was a problem in how the data was collected. Okay. So an intern, if you're a PGY2 or 3, an intern comes to you, PGY1 comes to you and says, hey, you know what? I really want to get started. For a case report, how do I get started? Which of those A, B, C, D, or E do you say? Do you say personal experience? You say advice from experts, guidelines, networking from friends, or use the skeleton from previous work? Which is the best way of helping somebody start with a case report or with a research project? Anybody? Do you have somebody who ever comes to you and says, hey, I want to do research? Or maybe you're in that position where you're starting to think about research, and you go, what should I do? And if you go to equatornetwork.org, there are guidelines for every type of study that you could think of, right? Have you looked at this before? There is Squire for QI, CARE for case reports. So if you were going to do case reports, you would say, hey, I'm going to point towards CARE, and then I'm going to go to this equatornetwork.com, look at CARE, and see what the guidelines are, right? So there are already a framework of things available for you to follow. You don't have to generate it on your own, right? So if nothing else from the talk today, equatornetwork.org, it's free. It's definitely worth it. Let's go here. All right. So here are some funny William Safire's fumble rules. No sentence fragments. Proofread carefully to see if any words out. Don't use no double negatives. Avoid commas that are not necessary. Kill all exclamation points, and never use a long word when diminutive words will do. William Safire has a lot more rules to it. Title. Use a declarative title. Do not indicate what's in the body of the results because they need to read the paper to figure that out. Introduction. Introduction starts off with, whether you're writing a poster or a paper, introduction starts off with a broad statement about that problem and then cones into your hypothesis ultimately. Okay. Okay. How do you choose a journal to send your article to? We've had some trouble recently. So I'm going to talk. So these are our ex-chief residents, Jen Hines. On the left, she's at Henry Ford now doing critical care. Jen and I wrote a paper. We sent it it wasn't a great paper, but we sent it to a journal. And we got an email from them saying, hey, it'll cost you $500 to publish it. Predatory journal, right? It was not evident looking at the website that it was a predatory journal, right? So we're like, okay, we don't want to pay $500. Can you please let this be? And we'll go to some other journal. It got even more interesting. And what happened was, a few days later, one of our co-authors, she's doing cardiology in Ohio somewhere, she looked up our paper, and it was already published on that site, right? We hadn't paid anything yet. So we called them up and said, hey, we don't want to publish with you. Can you please take it off? They said, it'll cost you $500 to take it off. I'm not making this up. We actually had to get our lawyer involved from our hospital, send them a letter to get our publication off the internet. Look for predatory journals. They're out there. We just went through a whole process trying to get our manuscript back. It was not fun. Okay, now you guys know about impact factor, right? So which of those things do you need to make an impact factor of a journal? Number of articles published in the last 2 years, and what? A, B, C, D, or E? A, C. Okay, A and C. Anybody with something else? Okay, so it's the number of citations, right? So one of the things that you have to be careful about is that the number of citations really varies in each field, right? And review articles may not have as many as an original article may, but it is the number of citations that makes the impact factor. The other thing that people don't always know about is what is the Ingelfinger-Relman rule? Does somebody know what Ingelfinger rule is? So Ingelfinger, I was in Boston University, never met the guy, he's before my time, but he was a gastroenterologist at Boston University. He came up with this rule called the Ingelfinger-Relman rule. What Ingelfinger rule really means is you cannot publish something at one place and try to publish it again at a different place. Or you can't publish it in a throwaway journal somewhere and then try to make a paper out of it, right? You can still go make a conference like a poster and go present it at a national meeting, that's okay. But you can't publish it somewhere, that data, and then try to take it back to a journal and say, now it's time to publish it. Because there is a certification that you sign, and if they find that you have published it somewhere, they will not publish that paper. Does that make sense? For the people who have actually written a paper, who had written a paper before? How was that experience for you? Long. It is a draining process to write it, isn't it? It's like you send in a cover letter, it goes to the editor sends it out to the reviewers sometimes send in these long reviews that can be negative towards your ego, right? The most important thing is never respond back in anger. It sometimes feels like you should do it, but you shouldn't do it, right? Look at that thing and go, okay, I'm going to put this away for a few days, and then respond kindly to every point that they made, and send it back, and hopefully it'll get published. Excellent book from the ACP, How to Write, Publish, and Present in Health Sciences. Not that expensive. So if you had, say, $70 from your institution, or maybe if your program bought a copy or two. The last time I actually had this book, I gave it to a resident, and she brought it back on her graduation day, and she said, I have a graduation present for you. I was like, that's an interesting thing. I'm not graduating. I didn't expect a graduation present. And she gave me my book back, which I gave it back to her. I said, okay, if you've kept it this long, you probably need it. And she's now doing cardiology, so I'm hoping she's still using it. But it's an excellent book, strongly recommended. And that was it. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take it. I know I rushed through some slides, but ultimately, if you reach the point of you're writing a paper, it's going to be a time-consuming process, but it's totally worth it. Because if you really think about it, when you apply for a fellowship, what makes you stand out than your fellow resident? It's not the clinical experience usually, right? Because most of you are probably good clinicians, and your program will probably write really good letters saying you're a wonderful clinician, right? And you can always find an attending or two who thinks you're God's gift to earth, right? They go, oh, this is the best resident I've met. I read a lot of letter recommendations, and they all look very similar. They say, this is the best resident I've ever worked with, right? And so you go, what makes you stand out then, right? It's publications and research. And the reason some of the competitive fellowships look at this is because if you can manage to get all those letters and do well clinically and still manage all those publications and posters and papers, then you must be really bright and able to multitask. Right? That's not the only reason to do research. It's not just about fellowship, right? If it is something that drives you, I just met somebody who, just this wonderful guy, I was doing an interview, and I said, hey, you know what, tell me about your passions outside of medicine. And he said, I used to live in a different state. My wife used to live in Ann Arbor. I used to drive there every day. And I was driving. I thought, hey, you know what, I drive a lot. I should find out more about cars. And so he figured out what is overdrive, I think he said, and what is the angle, and what is acceleration, and what is theta and beta, whatever. I was like, I just try to figure out if I hit the guy in front not to do it again. But this guy was obviously a scientist. He also had a PhD, and he had lots of bench experience. He was a scientist. He was a thinker. He looked at this and said, I want to solve this problem. He thinks it made him a safer driver. I'm not sure about that. But he definitely knew a lot about cars, about acceleration. And that's what drives him. Like, this guy is always looking for an answer to a problem, right? And if you're one of those driven people who wants to not just depend on other people's responses to questions, but generate answers that people will look up, publish it. Make a poster and publish it as well. All right. Best of luck to all of you. Have a safe drive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saneja, for that good talk. Before you leave, please remember to do your survey. We allowed a few minutes here, so you should have received a blue piece of paper with a code. Did you receive that? Yes? Survey Monkey. What was that? There's a Survey Monkey thing that will go out at 4 as well, if they don't already have. Okay, yeah. So please, we rely on those results as a committee very much in planning this program series. So thank you very much for attending, especially for those of you who attended all 3 workshops. We hope you found them helpful. In the spring, we will have our research forum, so you may be a part of that or you may also attend that. So anyway, thank you very much. Have a safe drive back.